There is a vast, uncharted region of territory known as the Northwest Territories that may be found at the farthest northernmost part of Canada. This is an area of unadulterated, breathtaking beauty. The globe is filled with vast forests, rugged mountains, and rivers that are both powerful and winding. In order to provide you with an idea of the magnitude of this single land, it is 4 times larger than the entirety of the country of Germany. Nevertheless, the Northwest Territories have a population of approximately 50,000 people, in contrast to Germany, which is home to more than 80 million people. This location is among the most inaccessible, rugged, and sparsely populated areas on the entire planet. A land that is truly wild. In addition, a valley may be found smack dab in the middle of this enormous wilderness. A region of terrain that is 10,000 square miles in size and is so remote and difficult to access that it is thought that there are still parts of it that no human being has ever set foot in. The Nahanni Valley is the name given to this location. Over the course of several centuries, the Nahanni Valley has been a site of lore, a location that has been discussed in hushed tones between campfires among people. The indigenous peoples of the area have said for a long time that it is a place that should be avoided. Dark ghosts and odd happenings can be found in this location. The Naha were notable for being one of the first known tribes to attempt to establish a home there. The valley was their home for a period of time, but eventually, for reasons that are not clear, they disappeared. Suddenly, they vanished, leaving behind a vibrant community that had been there for a day with them. As if they had just vanished into the thin, chilly air, all of their possessions, including their pottery, their tools, and their dwellings, were left behind. It was only in their writings that they left any traces behind. In their writing, they described odd animals that were pallid and hunted the forests at night. White devils, or Swahila, was the name they gave to them. From the beginning of their writings, they were overwhelmed with an ever-increasing sense of fear regarding these aliens, and suddenly, they simply stopped writing. The Naha had passed away. The other tribes that inhabited in the area did not completely disappear, but they did run away. As they packed up their belongings and left the valley, they vowed that they would never return, therefore establishing the Nahanni as a location that was both cursed and forbidden. These were merely thought to be old tales, folklore that was intended to keep people away for a considerable amount of time. At the beginning of the 20th century, however, a sequence of actual events began to take place in the Nahanni Valley. The occurrences were so peculiar and terrible that they gave the impression that the old legends might not be legends at all. The true beginning of our story takes place in 1904, with 3 brothers. Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod were the 4 individuals in question. Gold prospectors who lived and worked in the Northwest Territories were the toughest and most experienced individuals in the industry. It was common knowledge that they were familiar with the tales that were told about the Nahanni Valley. They were well aware that it was regarded as a foreboding and even haunted location. In contrast, a gold prospector may view a location that everyone else is too terrified to explore as an opportunity to pursue their interests. Assuming that no one had entered the room, they reasoned that the gold must have been taken by no one. The Nahanni Valley is a place that is so beautiful and unspoiled that it is impossible for there not to be gold there. Consequently, the 3 McLeod brothers made the decision that they were going to be the ones to face the valley, despite the cautions and the horrible legends that were spoken about it. They said their goodbyes to their family, gathered their belongings, and then embarked on their journey through the wilderness. The process of entering the valley was a challenge in and of itself. At that time, there were no highways or actual trails. The decision to travel by boat meant that they would have to endure a difficult trek upriver. They had to cross perilous waters, and at numerous points, they were required to physically disassemble their boat, take the pieces of lumber and their gear up and past large waterfalls, and then reconstruct the boat on the opposite side of the river. Although it was a difficult and grueling process that would have deterred the majority of people, the McLeods were unwavering in their commitment. In due time, the effort that they put in paid off. Ironically, the Flat River is a violent and turbulent river that slices through the middle of the valley. They arrived to the primary waterway that provides access to the valley. In order to find a little section of beachfront where they could beach their boat and set up a camp, they maneuvered through its rapids until they discovered it. They found themselves encircled by enormous mountains and deep trees that were completely silent. Despite the fact that it was a frightening environment, they were there for a specific cause. As they entered the icy river, they retrieved their equipment, including their sluices, and continued their journey. They located it almost shortly after search. Golden. And it's not just a few bits of snow. It was difficult to believe. One might get the impression that the entire riverbed was glistening with it. Over the course of several days, from dawn to dusk, they labored tirelessly to extract an extraordinary quantity of gold from water. This was the score of a lifetime, beyond everything they could have ever imagined achieving. Finally, they had amassed such a large quantity of gold that they were unable to physically transport any more of it. Their boat was completely full, and they were aware that it was time to depart, sell their discoveries, and then make preparations for a subsequent journey. As they began their journey back down the Flat River, they arrived at their destination in a positive frame of mind. They had a lot of money. They were successful in their gamble. It was clear that the valley would not allow them to go without a fight. During the course of their journey across a particularly turbulent stretch of the river, their overloaded boat became entangled in the stream, causing it to capsize. Anything and everything was hurled into the water that was churning in an instant. Despite being drenched in water and shivering, the brothers were able to safely make their way to the shore. As they retrieved their rifles and the few supplies they were able to recover, they discovered that the gold had been completely depleted. It was gone for all time, having sunk to the bottom of the swiftly running river due to its depth. Even though they were in utter disarray, they managed to pull through. They were aware that there was further gold on the other side of that. So they went back to the spot where they had initially set up their tent. They made preparations to begin their journey anew in the morning and put up their tent. They arose early the following morning and once again made their way to the river, returning to the very same location where they had discovered a fortune just a few days before. On the other hand, there was nothing this time. In spite of spending the entire day excavating, sluicing, and hunting for flake, they were unable to locate even a single one. As if the gold had disappeared, the Naha tribe had also disappeared at the same time. They remained for a few more days, but they were aware that they needed to go because their supplies were running low and their boat was no longer available. They were able to live, and they were aware that the valley contained a hidden riches that was sufficient for the time being. They began the long and painful journey out of the valley on foot, packing up what little they had left and packing up their belongings. Willie and Frank, the two younger brothers, were more determined than they had ever been before when they finally made it back to civilization. They had already begun contemplating their subsequent journey. In spite of the fact that they had saw the gold with their own eyes, they were not going to allow a single obstacle to deter them. However, Charlie, the family's oldest brother, had a different opinion. The encounter had left him feeling unsettled. When they were out there, by themselves in that huge desert, he couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to passing away. He conveyed to his brothers that he would not be returning. Even though he was certain that they would most likely discover further gold, he wished them luck. However, his time in the Nahanni Valley had come to an end. Willie and Frank were dissatisfied, but they were sympathetic to the situation. They discovered a guy named Robert Weir, who was willing to join them in their endeavor. The new Weir family, consisting of Willie, Frank, and Robert Weir, embarked on their journey 1 year later, at the beginning of 1905, with the intention of returning to the Nahanni Valley. Everyone in their community was aware of their intended destination and the things they were looking forward to discovering. They did not have a predetermined date for their return. A journey of this nature could have lasted for several months or even a whole year back in those days. You simply went, and by the time you returned, you had already returned. After a few weeks, months passed. It was a shift of seasons. For the entirety of the year, Willie, Frank, and Robert did not communicate with one another in any way. People in the village began to feel anxious, but Charlie, the brother who had remained behind, calmed everyone, removing their concerns. He informed them that his brothers had a lot of experience. They had a sense of what they were doing. He described the valley as challenging but not insurmountable. He reassured everyone that they should not be concerned. On the other hand, another year went by. Now, the year was 1907. Over the course of 2 full years, his brothers had made their way into that valley. Even Charlie was unable to dispute the fact that something was awry at this point. The amount of time that had passed without any communication was simply too lengthy. He was aware that he needed to go and look for them. He assembled a search group consisting of 4 other men, and together they embarked on a journey into the Nahanni Valley. They followed the same perilous path that he had traveled with his brothers many years earlier. After leading his men up the flat river, Charlie headed in the direction of the same shoreline where they had slept earlier. Upon arrival at the location, they discovered that his siblings and their camp had vanished without a trace. They proceeded on their way, making further inroads into the valley. At that point, the river made a dramatic turn that was almost 90 degrees, and this location is known as the Big Bend. As a result of this turn, they entered a portion of the valley that is commonly referred to as Second Canyon. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. On either side of them, the walls of the canyon climbed higher, giving the impression of steep cliffs that rose thousands of feet into the sky. Because of the steepness of the walls and the proximity of the walls to the water, there was no space for a boat to land. Once you entered Second Canyon, you were obligated to travel 10 miles in this claustrophobic passageway that was completely dark. The wind howled down the canyon, producing a peculiar sound that was similar to whistling and nearly sounded like a moan. They were able to see the dark holes of hundreds of caverns from a prominent vantage point on the cliff walls, which appeared to be empty eyes watching them pass by. The location felt spooky and frightening to be in. Later on, the guys would assert that they had the unsettling and persistent sensation that they were being observed at all times. As they made their way through the canyon, which was 10 miles long, they searched the water and the cliffs for any indication that the guys had gone missing inside. They were eventually able to emerge from the stifling shadow of Second Canyon, and as they did so, the valley suddenly became more open. This location, once again, included a few isolated stretches of shoreline, and they got a glimpse of it on one of those quaint beaches farther up ahead. It is a tent. Their hearts leapt for joy. While they were calling out the names of Willie and Frank, they navigated their boat in the direction of the beach. They quickly made their way to the campsite when they beached the boat. They noticed a figure sleeping on the ground close to some trees as they came closer to the position. It was a man who was unconscious and lying on his back, with his arm extended in a manner that suggested he was attempting to grab the weapon that was leaning against a nearby tree. After that, they discovered another body, this one lying face down and partially within the tent and partially outside of it. They were getting closer as the horrific reality of the situation grew more and more apparent. The heads of both of the males were out of place. Charlie was able to determine the identities of the deceased by using personal belongings that were discovered at the camp. Willie and Frank were his brothers. They were his brothers. Robert Weir seemed to be nowhere to be found. A search group went around the camp looking for anything. The etching was discovered by them cut into the tree at the location where the weapon was leaning. It stated, "We have found a fine prospect." This gave the impression that they had discovered gold. Nevertheless, a comprehensive investigation of the camp and the riverbank in the vicinity led to the discovery of nothing. There was not a single ounce of gold ever discovered. The event was really unsettling to witness. One of the brothers was obviously reaching for his firearm at the time of his death. It seemed as though the other individual had been attempting to escape from the tent. Moreover, their heads were completely absent. After collecting as much information as they could, Charlie and his men left the valley, bearing the weighty news of what they had discovered before them. They informed the mounted police about all that had happened. The authorities began their own inquiry into the matter. However, despite the fact that they discovered another skeleton a little distance downstream, which was also missing its head, they refused to identify it as belonging to Robert Weir. The official conclusion that they came to was that Willie and Frank had simply passed out due to malnutrition and that animals had taken their heads off of them. Charlie was angry with rage. He was well aware that this was not logical. What was written on the tree, where the bodies were located, and what was missing from the heads. As a whole, it indicated that there was something violent and something sinister. The case, however, was resolved. On the other hand, the news quickly traveled throughout the Northwest Territories like wildfire to everyone. A horrifying new chapter had been added to the story of the valley that was said to be cursed. Additionally, beginning on that day, the region of the Nahanni Valley that encompassed Second Canyon all the way to the location where the McLeod brothers were discovered was renamed accordingly. Eventually, people began to refer to it as the Headless Valley. A small number of people had the courage to trek inside the Nahanni during the subsequent few years. In addition to being too recent, the narrative of the McLeod brothers was also too terrifying. In order to entice people to enter a location where men lost their heads, the promise of wealth was not sufficient attraction. But recollections are short-lived, and greed is a potent driver of behavior. 5 years after the brothers were discovered, in 1913, a prospector by the name of Martin Jorgensen made the decision that he was courageous enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to try his luck at finding the brothers. As a solitary individual, he was a hardy outdoorsman who was confident in his ability to deal with anything the valley had in store for him. At a distance of approximately 70 miles from the Headless Valley, he ventured into the Nahanni region by himself, and, rather than establishing a temporary camp, he constructed a modest and durable hut for himself. Because he was confident that he would make his fortune there, he intended to remain for an entire year. And it appeared that he was correct for a period of time. Due to the fact that he was able to communicate the news to his business associates, we are aware that he discovered gold. A straightforward and victorious message was sent. It seemed as though he had hit it rich. Once a year had passed, he instructed them to meet him at a location that had been prearranged outside of the valley. After a year had passed, his companions made their way to the scheduled meeting location. Even though they waited, Martin Jorgensen did not appear at any point. Due to the fact that this was absolutely out of character, his partners made the decision to descend into the valley in order to locate him. They were armed with the directions that he had sent. As they continued to follow his track, they were eventually able to locate the site of his cabin. However, the cabin was no longer there. What was left behind was nothing more than a heap of burnt wood and ash. It had been entirely consumed by fire and gone up in flames. In addition, the decapitated body of Martin Jorgensen was discovered lying on the ground close to the decaying remains of the cabin. To reiterate, there was no gold to be discovered anywhere in the area. It was decided to call in the mounted police once more. Yet another investigation was carried out by them. Again, they came up with an explanation that was completely in line with the natural world. They came to the conclusion that Jorgensen must have used his stove in a way that caused an accident, which was the cause of the fire. Predation by animals was the cause of the missing head, as was the case with the lost head. It was yet another case that had been resolved, yet another horrible event that occurred in the harsh woods. However, the trend was becoming increasingly difficult for many people to ignore. 8 years later, in 1921, John O'Brien and an anonymous partner, 2 other prospectors, made the decision to test their luck and see what would happen. Despite the fact that they were aware of the tales, they were of the belief that there was a return for every risk. The Headless Valley itself was not too far away from where they established their tent. And very immediately, they discovered gold, just like the others had done. They disseminated the news that they had achieved their goals and that they intended to remain for a considerable amount of time. It had been a couple of weeks since they had begun their journey, and they were getting low on food. Along the path that they used to enter the valley, they had placed a number of animal traps in various locations. For the purpose of examining the traps, John O'Brien informed his partner that he was going to make the journey. It was a lengthy trek that would take him 8 or 9 days to complete, and it was a circuit. For the sake of protecting their wealth and supplies, his partner remained in the camp with them. In spite of the passage of 9 days, John O'Brien did not come back. His companions started to feel concerned about him. It was by accident that he came upon another solitary prospector who was in the vicinity, and the two men decided to undertake the mission of searching for O'Brien together. They continued to call his name as they followed the line of traps. They walked for a considerable amount of time. At the moment when the sun was beginning to drop, they entered a tiny clearing. One of the fallen logs was located in the middle of the clearing. In addition, there was a man who was seated on the log with his back to them. "John, is that you?" they yelled out, but there was no response to their question. Completely still, the figure remained in that position. They moved closer with increased caution. They made their way around the log, and as they did so, they saw that it was, in fact, John O'Brien. He was sitting in an upright position, his demeanor uninterested, and he was simply staring into the ashes of a small bonfire that had been extinguished at his feet. He had a book of matches in his hand, and he was holding it tightly. In addition, he had been fully and utterly frozen to death. It was a peculiar fact that the temperature had not been very low. The police, who later inspected the site, said in their report that it appeared as though he had been slain so suddenly that he had no time to react, no time to even realize what was happening. They said that it was as if he had been flash frozen. In the midst of the forest, he remained still, like a statue completely frozen in place. At this point, the stories were stacking up. Burned cabins, headless bodies, and a guy frozen solid make up the scene. The authorities continued to explain that each of these instances was distinct and unrelated to one another, and that they were simply the brutal facts of living in the wild. However, the general public was not entirely convinced. There was a widespread consensus that the Nahanni Valley was a haunted and cursed location at this point. Then, in the year 1926, an event that was both one of the most peculiar and chilling of all time occurred. In the valley, a wealthy hunting party made their entrance. There were perhaps 12 of them, and they were being guided by an experienced guide. It was their belief that there was protection in numbers. They established their camp in close proximity to the river, not too far from the Headless Valley. Nothing of note happened on the first day. After going on a hunt, they went back to their camp and spent the evening around a large bonfire, enjoying each other's company while exchanging stories. They awoke the following morning to discover that one of their party members had vanished without a trace. Annie Lafferty, a young woman, became absent from the scene. She had not yet removed her possessions from her tent. There was no note, and there was no indication that there had been a struggle. In the middle of the night, she had simply disappeared without a trace. The group spent the entire day looking for her, searching the woods and shouting her name numerous times, but they were unable to locate any trace of her. Eventually, they were forced to leave the valley and declare her missing to the authorities. An extensive and official search procedure was initiated. Because her family was so powerful and wealthy, they spared no cost in their spending. But after a number of weeks of hunting, they came up empty-handed. The valley itself seemed to have engulfed Annie Lafferty, as if she had been consumed by it. A man named Charlie, who was known for his solitude and his love of the outdoors, was found in a pub in one of the smaller villages located in the Northwest Territories a few months later. Some men were discussing the mysterious disappearance of Annie Lafferty, and he overheard them talking about it. A look of horror appeared on his face as he listened to the specifics of the incident, including the date and the location. It dawned on him that he had been present. Something had been observed by him. His astonishing narrative was promptly relayed to the authorities, and he went to the police station. During the period when the hunting team was stationed in the Nahanni Valley, he explained that he had been camping by himself in the valley. Even in the evening, he was close enough to them that he could hear their voices. He was not too far away. It was the night that Annie vanished, and he claimed that he was unable to sleep. It was while he was sitting outside his tent that he became aware of a peculiar sound. The sound that could be heard was that of little rocks being dropped into the river, one after the other. The sound was not a natural one, like the sound of rock slides. It appeared to be intentional. He stood up and made his way towards the riverbank in a stealthy manner in order to gain a better glimpse. It was a full moon, and it was shining brightly, which illuminated the area. He turned his gaze downstream, in the direction of the position of the hunting party's camp. He then became aware of it. A woman was climbing up a high, rocky ridge that ran alongside the river while she was absolutely naked. She was on all fours. Unlike a coyote, she was traveling at an unnaturally fast speed, similar to that of an animal. Both her hands and her feet were responsible for the dislodging of small stones, which then fell down the bank and splashed into the river with each step that she took. His ears had been picking up on that particular sound. He stood there, still, observing her in silence. It seemed to him that she was completely insane, and that she would perish from exposure out there. Nevertheless, she came to a halt just as she reached the highest point of the ridge. It appeared as though she was looking right at him when she moved her head. In addition, Charlie reported to the authorities that her face had been contorted into a frightening and inhumane grimace. As he described it, her eyes appeared to be utterly possessed. Because he was so afraid, he stumbled backward and hurried back to his tent, where he might find refuge from the danger. Over the crest of the ridge, the woman disappeared without a trace. Charlie was shown an image of Annie Lafferty, the woman who had gone missing, despite the fact that the police were still doubtful. Without any sign of doubt, he acknowledged it. He had seen the woman rushing naked on all fours into the dark core of the Nahanni Valley. That was the woman he had seen. There was no further sighting of Annie. The number of victims proceeded to reach new heights. In 1931, a prospector by the name of Phil Powers constructed a cabin, discovered gold, and then vanished without a trace. His charred cabin was discovered by a search party that had been sent out. Although the body of Powers was found inside, the investigation discovered that the fire had begun on the roof, which indicates that he would have had a sufficient amount of time to flee the building. As a result, it was determined that it was highly probable that he had already passed away inside his cabin before the fire even began. The year 1936 saw the disappearance of two other prospectors, namely William Epper and Joseph Mulholland. In addition, their cottage was discovered to be completely destroyed by fire. However, this time there were no remains found at all. Simply put, they had disappeared. At the campsite where he was staying in 1945, the body of a guy named Ernest Sabard was discovered inside his sleeping bag. Additionally, he was a prospector who had vanished without a trace. The search crew discovered him without his head when they found him. The year 1946 saw the occurrence of the last important incident. An additional large search party was dispatched to the area in an effort to locate a missing prospector by the name of John Patterson. The individual who was in charge of this search party was a man who was resolute, unyielding, and unwavering in his commitment to unraveling the enigma. They established their fortifications in the Headless Valley, which was the same region in which the McLeod brothers had been discovered. They were sitting around their fire one evening when, all of a sudden, a man emerged from the shade of the forest. The native man wore traditional garb and was dressed in traditional garb. Immediately, he approached the person who was in charge of the search party. His name was not disclosed by him. This is a terrifying warning that he just issued. After that, he informed them that they had to depart the valley without delay. According to him, there were white creatures that were walking around in the woods all around them, and they were very close to their camp. Before the leader of the search group could ask any questions, the man turned around, walked back into the forest, and vanished without a trace. All of the members of the search team were terrified that night by the horrific sounds that emanated from the forest that were all around them. In addition to the sound of enormous trees smashing to the ground, they heard screams and wails that went through their bodies. It was reported by a few of the men that they had witnessed tall white figures moving between the trees that were located on the edge of the firelight. As soon as the sun rose the following morning, they decided to give up their hunt for John Patterson and get away from the valley completely. In a later statement, the leader of the party, the individual who had entered the valley with such a high level of self-assurance, stated that he had never been more terrified in his entire life and that he would never again set foot in that valley. We were never able to locate John Patterson. After that, it appeared as though the odd occurrences in the Nahanni Valley had stopped. However, this is primarily due to the fact that people stopped going in. There were now too many of them, they were too consistent, and they were too terrifying to remain ignored. Thereafter, in the year 1976, the Government of Canada took an unusual action. National park status was bestowed upon the Nahanni Valley by the government. On the surface, it appeared as though this was a move to preserve the natural beauty of the area. In contrast, if you examine the park's regulations in greater detail, you will notice something peculiar. The area does not have any tourist facilities, visitor centers, or trails that are clearly marked. And perhaps most importantly, there are significant portions of the park that have been designated as being completely off-limits to visitors. Nobody is permitted to enter these areas at any time. Neither visitors nor researchers, and not even employees of the park. In addition, the Headless Valley serves as the focal point of the largest of these restricted areas. There is still a legal prohibition against entering the very locations where all of these strange and horrifying events took place, and this prohibition continues to this day. There are a lot of people who think that the government did not establish the park in order to protect the valley from people. They are under the impression that it was designed to shield people from whatever is located in the valley. Annie Lafferty continued to be a mystery, and the mystery of what happened to all of those prospectors has not been solved. The Nahanni Valley is a place where no one is permitted to look, and it is there that the valley conceals its information. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? In 1993, David Lewis was a man who seemed to have it all. He was a successful and well-respected lawyer living in Amarillo, Texas. He had a loving wife, Karen, and a beautiful 9-year-old daughter. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man, the kind of guy who coached his daughter's sports teams and spent his free time helping out with local charities. His life was stable, predictable, and happy. On January 28th of that year, a Thursday, Karen and their daughter were getting ready for a fun weekend trip. They were heading to Dallas, a few hours away, for a mother-daughter shopping spree. It was something they were both really looking forward to. Normally, David would have tagged along, making a family trip out of it. But this particular weekend was a big one for sports fans. The Super Bowl was on that Sunday, the 31st, and David didn't want to miss it. He was a huge fan and wanted to enjoy the game from the comfort of his own home. So he said his goodbyes, and Karen and their daughter drove off to Dallas, leaving David to have the house to himself for a couple of days. They had their trip, and then on Sunday, after the big game had finished, they made the drive back home to Amarillo. As they pulled into the driveway, they were expecting to walk in and find David either cleaning up some game day snacks or maybe watching the post-game analysis. When they stepped inside, the house was quiet. The first thing Karen noticed was that the TV was still on, tuned to the channel that had just aired the Super Bowl. That wasn't too strange. But David was nowhere to be found. Karen called out his name, but there was no answer. She walked through the familiar rooms of their home, a little confused but not yet worried. She figured maybe he had gotten a last-minute invitation to watch the second half at a friend's house and just hadn't called. She noticed the VCR was still recording. This was classic David. He was known for recording all the major sporting events so he could watch them again later. The fact that the VCR was still running meant he hadn't been the one to turn it off. It was just another small, slightly odd detail. Karen continued her search, calling his name. She went into the kitchen, and that's when things started to feel a little more unsettling. She opened the refrigerator door, maybe looking for a note, or just seeing what was inside. And there, on a shelf, was a plate with 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches. This was a sandwich David made all the time, his go-to snack. But why would he make 2 sandwiches and then just leave them in the fridge, uneaten? It didn't make sense. She closed the fridge door and turned around. On the kitchen counter, she saw something that made her pause. It was David's wedding band and his watch, just sitting there. Now, this was truly strange. A man might forget his wallet, but leaving behind his wedding ring and his watch was different. It felt personal. Still, Karen tried to rationalize it. There were no signs of a break-in. Nothing was stolen or out of place. There was absolutely no evidence of a struggle. The house was exactly as it should be, just without David in it. Her best guess was that he had simply stepped out in a hurry and would be back soon. So, Karen waited up for a while, but as the hours ticked by, she eventually went to bed, telling herself he would surely be there in the morning. But when she woke up the next day, the other side of the bed was still empty. David had not come home. Now, real worry began to set in. The strange little details from the night before suddenly felt much more sinister. She knew something was wrong. She called the police and reported her husband missing. The Amarillo police began their investigation immediately. It didn't take them long to find a major clue. Within 24 hours, they located David's car. It was parked and abandoned in a downtown lot not far from the courthouse where he often worked. When they searched the vehicle, they found his keys, both for the car and the house, tucked away under one of the floor mats. Inside the car, everything seemed to be in order. His checkbook was there. His credit cards were in the glove compartment. His driver's license was right where it should be. Nothing of value had been taken. Investigators then looked into his recent financial activity, and that's when the story took another strange turn. They saw he had recently made a deposit of $5,000 into the family bank account. That seemed more like someone planning for their family's future than someone in trouble. But then they found something else. He had also recently purchased 2 one-way plane tickets. One was from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the other was from Dallas back to Amarillo. Police couldn't determine if he had actually used these tickets, but it added to a growing theory that maybe David had chosen to disappear. When the police presented all of this to Karen, the abandoned car, the untouched valuables, the bank activity, she told them something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. She said that just before he disappeared, David had told her that he believed his life might be in danger. He was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month. It was for a complicated conflict of interest case involving his old law firm and one of their very wealthy, very powerful clients. According to Karen, David was being heavily pressured by his former colleagues to lie to cover up some of the firm's wrongdoings. But David was an honest man. He had told his family that he was going to tell the absolute truth in his deposition, no matter whose reputation it destroyed. He knew this decision would make him a lot of enemies. He understood that telling the truth put a huge target on his back. This information was a bombshell. The police were certainly intrigued. It painted a picture of a man caught in a dangerous situation, not one who would just walk away from his family. But the problem was, it was just a story. They had no hard evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David Lewis. It was a compelling theory, but without proof, it was just that, a theory. For the next 11 months, investigators followed every lead they could find. They interviewed his former colleagues. They looked into the wealthy client from the lawsuit, but they found nothing. No new information surfaced. There were no sightings of David. He never called home. He never used his credit cards or his social security number. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished from the face of the earth. After nearly a year with no progress, the police officially decided to close the case. The official conclusion was that David Lewis had left of his own accord. They ruled out foul play. For David's family, this was a devastating blow. They had to try and accept the unacceptable, that David was gone, and they would likely never know what truly happened to him. The years passed, and the mystery of his disappearance remained a painful, open wound. Then, in 2004, 11 years after David vanished, something incredible happened. A state trooper in Washington state was sitting at his computer browsing the internet. He had an interest in unsolved mysteries and was looking through old cold cases. He clicked on a page and a picture of David Lewis popped up on his screen. The trooper stared at the photo. He felt an immediate jolt of recognition. The face looked exactly like an unidentified victim from a hit-and-run case he had worked on way back in 1993. His heart pounding, he pulled up the old case file. The details matched up in a chilling way. The John Doe victim had been struck by a vehicle and killed just one day after David Lewis was reported missing in Texas. The man had been found on the side of Highway 24 inches, rural Washington state, a staggering 1,600 miles away from Amarillo. When he was found, this John Doe was dressed from head to toe in military-style clothing. He had no wallet, no identification, and no luggage or bags of any kind. He was just walking aimlessly down the side of a remote highway. Despite the immense distance and the strange circumstances, the trooper felt a growing certainty that this was David. But as he looked back at the picture of David Lewis, he noticed David was wearing glasses. He tried to remember if the John Doe from 1993 had been wearing glasses, and he didn't think so. It was a small detail, but it could be the one that proved him wrong. Just to be sure, he checked the evidence log, the list of personal belongings found on the body, and there it was. The John Doe did have a pair of glasses on him. And when he saw the description, it was a perfect match to the exact same kind of glasses David was wearing in his photo. It wasn't long before DNA testing was done, and the results came back as a definitive match. The John Doe from Washington was without a doubt David Lewis. After 11 long years, the mystery of where David went was finally solved. But it only opened up an even bigger, more disturbing mystery. Why? Why would David travel 1,600 miles to Washington, a state where he had no friends, no family, and no connections whatsoever? If he was the one who hit the record button on his VCR on Super Bowl night, that meant he had less than 24 hours to get from Amarillo, Texas, to that remote highway in Washington. He did it without his car, without his credit cards, and seemingly without any luggage. Where did the military clothing come from? Did he buy it? Or did someone make him wear it? What was he doing walking down that highway in the middle of nowhere? David's family has always believed that he was a victim of foul play. They believe his own words to his wife that his life was in danger because of the testimony he was about to give. They believe someone abducted him from his home, drove him across the country, and killed him, staging it to look like a random accident. But officially, the case remains closed. The police maintain that David Lewis left his home voluntarily, and his death on that lonely highway was nothing more than a tragic accident. In the year 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old woman living a quiet life in Houston, Texas. She worked as a loan officer at a Chase bank and was happily married to her husband, Jay. On the morning of October 12th, a Thursday, everything seemed perfectly normal. Mary Lou said goodbye to Jay and left for her job at the bank, just like she did every other weekday. That afternoon, Jay decided to give his wife a call at work just to check in. But she didn't pick up her phone. He left her a voicemail, figuring she was just busy with a customer and didn't think much of it. But as the afternoon wore on and she didn't call him back, a small seed of concern started to grow. This was very out of character for Mary Lou. She always returned his calls. By 5 p.m., when Mary Lou should have been finishing up her workday, Jay still hadn't heard from her. He called her again, but once more, the call went straight to voicemail. Now, his concern was turning into real worry. He decided to call Mary Lou's supervisor at the bank. The supervisor picked up, and Jay asked if he could speak to his wife. And the supervisor's response sent a chill down his spine. He told Jay that Mary Lou hadn't come into work at all that day. They had tried to get in touch with her as well, but couldn't reach her. In that moment, Jay knew something was terribly wrong. He immediately hung up and dialed 911, reporting his wife missing. The police had barely even started their search for Mary Lou when another call came into the station. It was from a man who had been riding his ATV on a remote dirt road about 3 miles from the Morrises' home. He told the dispatcher that he had just stumbled upon a smoldering, burnt-out car, and he could see what looked like a body in the driver's seat. It turned out that the fire department had actually received a call earlier that day, around 10 inches the morning, about smoke being seen in that same area. But at the time, they had assumed it was just a controlled burn on someone's property, so they didn't send a unit out to investigate. When police and emergency services arrived at the scene, they found the car was completely destroyed by the fire. The body inside was so badly burned that it was impossible to visually identify who it was. Investigators carefully sifted through the wreckage, and they were able to find a small tooth fragment. They sent it off for testing, and soon their worst fears were confirmed. Dental records proved that the victim was indeed Mary Lou Morris. It was immediately clear to investigators that this was no accident. This was a homicide. They found evidence that gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the interior of the car before it was set ablaze. It seemed the killer had tried to stage the scene, perhaps to make it look like a suicide or a tragic car fire. But because of the intense damage from the fire, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. They didn't know if Mary Lou was already deceased when she was placed in the car, or if the fire itself was what killed her. As police processed the scene, they noted that a number of Mary Lou's valuables, like her purse, were still inside the car. But one very important item was missing. Her wedding ring was not on her finger. The news of Mary Lou's brutal murder shocked her family and the entire community. She was known as a kind, gentle person who didn't have a single enemy in the world. No one could understand why anyone would want to hurt her. The day after her body was found, the case took another bizarre turn. A local Houston newspaper received a phone call from an anonymous man. All he said was, Mary Lou's death was an accident. The reporter on the line tried to press him for more information, asking who he was and what he meant, but the man simply hung up. The call was untraceable. At the exact same time this tragedy was unfolding for the Morris family, a completely separate drama was playing out for another woman in Houston. Her name, coincidentally, was also Mary Morris. This was 9-year-old. Mary McGinnis Morris. She was a successful and well-liked nurse practitioner. She generally got along with everyone at the clinic where she worked, with one notable exception. A new male nurse, a man named Dwayne Young, had recently started working there, and he was making her feel extremely uncomfortable. He seemed to have a problem with her for no apparent reason. One day, Mary McGinnis returned to her desk after seeing a patient and found something deeply disturbing. All of the framed photos of her family that she kept on her desk had been turned face down. And in the very center of her desk was a small piece of paper with 3 words written on it, death to her. She knew in her gut that it had to be Dwayne. But she had no proof. That night, she went home and told her husband Mike about what had happened. She told him about Dwayne and the note, and she said, I don't feel safe at work anymore. Can you teach me how to shoot a gun? Mike agreed. He took her to a range and taught her how to handle a firearm safely. He then bought her a small pistol, which she started keeping tucked under the driver's seat of her car, just in case. On October 16th, 4 days after Mary Lou Morris's body was found, and 3 days after that strange anonymous call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris finished her shift at the clinic and stopped at a drugstore on her way home. As soon as she walked inside, she noticed a man on the other side of the store who seemed to be watching her every move. She felt a wave of fear and immediately pulled out her cell phone and called her best friend, Lori. She described the strange man to Lori and asked what she should do. Lori told her to just wait, to pretend to shop until the man left the store. But the man didn't leave. He just stayed there, lingering in an aisle, staring at her. Finally, Mary McGinnis decided she couldn't wait any longer. She told Lori, "You know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I have to make a quick stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes." "I'll be fine." She hung up the phone, walked to the register, bought her items, and left the store. Just 12 minutes later, a frantic 911 call came in. It was Mary McGinnis Morris. The dispatcher could hear the sheer terror in her voice as she screamed that someone was trying to kill her. The contents of that 911 call have never been made public, reportedly because on the recording, you can actually hear the moment she is attacked. Later that night, Mary McGinnis was found in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her terrified 911 call that this was a homicide. But just like with the first Mary Morris, her killer had attempted to stage the scene to look like a suicide. The murder weapon, which was her own pistol that she kept under her seat, had been carefully placed on the seat next to her hand. None of her valuables had been stolen from the car. But, just like Mary Lou Morris, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After the murder of the second Mary Morris, police and the public began to speculate that these two cases had to be connected. It was just too much of a coincidence. Two women, sharing the same name, living in the same city, murdered within days of each other. In both cases, the crime scenes were staged to look self-inflicted. And in both cases, the victim's wedding ring was taken. A chilling theory began to form. This was a professional hit gone horribly wrong. The people who subscribed to this theory believed that Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target all along, and that the murder of Mary Lou Morris was a tragic mistake. They reasoned that a hitman was hired, given the name Mary Morris and a general location, and he simply killed the wrong woman first. Then, upon realizing his mistake, he was the one who anonymously called the newspaper to say her death was an accident. And a few days later, the hit was successfully carried out on the correct target, Mary McGinnis Morris. The detail about the missing wedding rings supported this theory, as it's reportedly a common practice for hitmen to take a personal item like that to prove to their client that the job is done. Police took this theory very seriously and began looking into who might want Mary McGinnis Morris dead. Their attention quickly turned to her husband, Mike. They discovered that he had recently accused her of having an affair and was said to be extremely angry about it. He also behaved suspiciously after her murder, refusing to take a polygraph test and not allowing the police to interview his daughter. And then there was the motive. Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy, and Mike was the sole beneficiary. It seemed like a classic case of a husband hiring a hitman to kill his wife. But when investigators dug deeper, they couldn't find a single piece of evidence that tied Mike to either his wife's murder or the murder of Mary Lou Morris. As for her creepy coworker, Dwayne Young, who wrote the death to her note, police determined that while he clearly disliked her, he was not involved in her death. And so, both of these incredibly strange and tragic cases went cold. To this day, no one has ever been arrested or charged in either murder. In 1996, Blair Adams was a 31-year-old man living in Surrey, a suburb of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. In his past, he had some struggles with alcoholism and substance abuse, but for the last 2 years, he had completely turned his life around. He was clean, sober, and had landed a great job as a foreman for a local construction company. He was known as a friendly, cheerful guy who was easy to get along with and had no known enemies. But in the summer of that year, something changed in Blair. He started exhibiting strange and uncharacteristic mood swings. His mother would later describe them as being frequent and wild. In just a matter of weeks, the calm, relaxed, and friendly man she knew transformed into someone who was constantly panicked and on edge. He was always looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be following him. The stress was so intense that he couldn't sleep at night. He began telling his friends and coworkers that he was convinced someone was trying to kill him. They were concerned, telling him that he wasn't okay and that he really needed to see a doctor. When his mother confronted him about his increasingly erratic and paranoid behavior, he was secretive. He told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." She pressed him, asking, "What's it?" But he just shook his head and said, "I can't say anything else." And that was all she could ever get out of him. Blair's strange behavior reached a crisis point on Friday, July 5th. He went to his bank and withdrew his entire life savings in cash, a total of $6,000. He then went to his safety deposit box and emptied it as well. It contained thousands of dollars worth of gold, platinum, and expensive jewelry. It was the kind of thing someone does when they're planning to run. 2 days later, on Sunday, he got in his car and drove 30 minutes to the U.S. Canada border. He attempted to cross into the United States, but he was turned away. To the border guards, he was a collection of red flags. A single man traveling alone, carrying a large amount of cash and valuables, and acting extremely nervous. He fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and they denied him entry. Frustrated, Blair drove back home. The next day, Monday, he showed up at his construction site and walked straight into his boss's office. He abruptly announced that he was quitting, effective immediately. He didn't even bother to pick up his final paycheck. He just turned around and walked away. From the construction site, he went directly to the airport. There, he walked up to a ticket counter and purchased a round-trip ticket to Frankfurt, Germany for $1,600. No one knows for sure why he wanted to go to Germany, but he had worked there briefly the year before. His flight was scheduled to depart the following day, on Tuesday. But as soon as he bought the ticket, Blair seemed to change his mind again. He suddenly decided he needed to try and get into the United States one more time. He rushed from the airport to a female friend's house. When she opened the door, she was shocked by his appearance. He looked completely disheveled and terrified. He told her, "Someone's trying to kill me. I need your help. Can you drive me across the border? They just rejected me a couple of days ago. You have kids. It'll look more convincing if I'm with a family." His friend was seriously spooked by his frantic behavior and told him she couldn't help. So Blair went home and hid out for the rest of the day. The next morning, Tuesday, he went back to the airport. But instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, he went to the ticket counter and asked for a refund. He told the agent that the person he was supposed to meet in Germany had gotten sick, so he couldn't go. The only person this could have been was a woman he had a brief fling with while working there the year before. But later, when investigators spoke to this German woman, she told them she hadn't been in touch with Blair at all and was definitely not expecting him to visit. After getting his refund, Blair left the airport and went to a car rental agency where he rented a Nissan Altima. He immediately drove back to the U.S. Canada border, and this time, for whatever reason, he was allowed to cross. He drove south to Seattle, Washington, went straight to the airport there, and simply abandoned his rental car in the middle of a parking lot. He then went inside and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. The ticket cost him $770. He could have bought a round-trip ticket for about half that price, but he specifically chose the more expensive one-way option. He boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was on the other side of the country in Washington, D.C. As soon as he got off the plane, he rented another car, this time a Toyota Camry, and started driving again. He drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair wasn't seen in Knoxville until around 5:30 that evening when he pulled into a gas station. He told the attendant that he was having trouble with his car. The attendant came out to take a look, and he immediately figured out the problem. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to the Nissan Altima he had abandoned in Seattle. The attendant pointed this out, but Blair, clearly confused, held up the key and insisted, "No, this is the one I was using." The attendant pointed to the Nissan logo on the key. Together, they searched the car inside and out, looking for the missing Toyota key, but it was nowhere to be found. Blair tried calling the rental company, but their office was already closed for the day. The gas station attendant told him there was nothing more he could do and that they would have to tow the car. But he offered to give Blair a ride to a nearby hotel. Blair accepted. Just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front doors of a Fairfield Inn. Hotel security footage captured what happened next. He walked in, stood in the lobby for a moment, then turned around and walked right back out. A few minutes later, he walked in again, and then walked out again. He did this over and over 5 separate times over the course of an hour. Finally, he approached the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk clerk later told police that Blair seemed completely paranoid. He was constantly looking over his shoulder and was visibly on edge the entire time. She gave him his room key, he paid in cash, and then instead of going up to his room, he turned around, walked out the front door one last time, and never came back. The next morning, 2 construction workers arrived at their job site, which was located in a vacant lot directly across the street from the Fairfield Inn. As they started their day, they discovered a body. It was Blair Adams. He was lying on the ground, and strangely, he was missing his shoes, his socks, and his pants. He had several scratches on his hands and face, but none of the injuries were life-threatening. Scattered on the ground all around his body was $4,000 in a mix of American, Canadian, and German currency. His fanny pack, full of all the expensive gold and jewelry from his safety deposit box, was also lying nearby. A black duffel bag containing maps and travel receipts was on the ground. And also, lying in the dirt, was the missing key to the Toyota Camry. An autopsy was performed, and the medical examiner determined that Blair had died from a single massive violent blow to his stomach that had ruptured his organs. They had no idea what could have caused such an injury. A toxicology report came back clean. There were no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only piece of forensic evidence found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was found clutching tightly in his fist. There were no witnesses to the attack, but a security guard at a nearby business reported hearing a woman's scream coming from the direction of the lot at around 3:30 that morning. The only real lead police had was a composite sketch of a man who several people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant shortly after he had left the hotel for the final time. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were completely baffled. Was Blair telling the truth all along? Had someone been hunting him for weeks, finally catching up to him in a vacant lot in Tennessee? If so, why didn't they take the thousands of dollars in cash and valuables that were lying right next to his body? Or was Blair suffering from a severe paranoid delusion, and his death was the result of a random, tragic encounter with a violent stranger? To this day, we still have no idea. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. The story that we are going to tell today is about a Hollywood actor whose life took a dark and violent turn, and it ended in a way that practically no one could have expected. A great number of individuals have not been exposed to this tale, but once it has been told to you, it is one that you will never be able to forget. Beginning with a young boy who had a dream of being on TV, everything begins with him. Johnny Lewis was only 7 years old when he was cast in his very first acting role throughout his childhood. In all honesty, it wasn't a major motion picture or a well-known television show. Rather, it was a little part in a video about escalator safety. To a child, however, it was a beginning, and it was the beginning of a career that would last a lifetime. Johnny began his career making appearances in dozens of commercials for major businesses, such as Pizza Hut, after he was cast in that little role. In a short amount of time, many working in the sector were able to recognize that this young man possessed actual talent. He was not merely another attractive face, he had the ability to seriously act. Soon after, he began making guest appearances on some of the most popular television shows running during the latter part of the 1990s and the early 2000s. These shows included Seventh Heaven, Malcolm in the Middle, and Drake and Josh. Johnny had reached the age of 18 by the year 2001. Having been employed in a consistent manner for a number of years, he had finally amassed sufficient funds to leave his parents' residence in the North Los Angeles neighborhood. When he moved in with a number of other young actors and actresses who were all striving to make their mark in the entertainment industry, he discovered a place that was located right in the middle of Hollywood. It was a thrilling period that was brimming with opportunities. The trajectory of Johnny's career continued to advance. Fast forward to the year 2006. Now that he is 23 years old, Johnny is simply soaring to new heights. He had secured more big jobs on television, including a recurring role on the immensely popular show The O.C. His face was becoming more and more known to millions of people. His personal life was also making headlines, in addition to the success he had achieved in his professional life. The megapop singer Katy Perry was his girlfriend at the time. The intensity of their relationship was stated to be extremely high, despite the fact that it did not persist for a very long time. It was so intense, in fact, that Katy would go on to write 2 songs that were inspired by their time together, according to reports. However, Johnny's true breakthrough into the public eye, the role that would come to define his career, did not come until 2008, 2 years later. Sons of Anarchy is a brand new biker drama, and he was chosen to play the role of Kip Halfsack Epps in the show. Both in terms of critical acclaim and financial success, the show was a giant. Not only did it make Johnny famous, but it also made him extraordinarily wealthy. He was a darling among the audience, and it appeared as though his future was sealed. And he had succeeded. However, there could be an issue. Johnny was finding himself increasingly anxious about the path that the show was headed, despite the fact that the entire globe adored the show. He had the impression that it was growing unusually violent. Let's face it, Johnny was not the fierce biker character that he portrayed on television. When he was in his real life, he was a quiet and thoughtful individual. When he was not studying philosophy, he enjoyed reading poetry. He did not appreciate going out to parties, but rather drank tea and played chess. He preferred staying up late. In his opinion, the concept of acting out scenes of violence that he considered to be unnecessary was not something that he felt comfortable with. He was not the same person as a result of that. Therefore, after 2 really successful seasons on the show, during which his character had become one of the most popular, he did something that was almost unheard of in the entertainment industry during that time. The writers of the show were informed by him that they needed to remove me from the screenplay. He went to them and told them, "This is something that I am no longer able to perform." The authors were utterly taken aback by the news. They pleaded with him to remain, telling him how well-liked he was and what the potential implications of this post could be for his future. However, Johnny had already made up his mind. As a result, his character, Halfsack, was sadly killed off on the show in 2009, bringing an end to his stint on production. Johnny came to the conclusion that he required a break from acting on a serious level when he left Sons of Anarchy. He desired to direct his efforts towards something that was more intimate, something creative, that was wholly and fully his own unique creation. He had the desire to compose a novel. It was originally planned that the novel would be about a young musical prodigy who was attempting to find his place in the world. In order to accomplish this, he was aware that he required a serene and calm location where he could concentrate without being distracted by the activities that were taking place in Hollywood. In order to find out if anyone knew of a location similar to that, he began doing some asking around and chatting to his pals. The writer's villa was a location that was mentioned at the time by his photographer. This stunning, expansive home with 6 bedrooms was available for rent and was situated just outside of Hollywood. It was known as the writer's villa. It had developed a reputation over the years as a type of haven for aspiring artists, performers, and authors who were still attempting to find their big break. This reputation had been earned over the course of many years. Kathy Davis, who was 81 years old at the time, was the proprietor, and she was the primary reason for this reputation. Kathy was a very nice and kind-hearted woman who had a deep understanding of how challenging and isolating it could be to pursue one's dreams in the Hollywood industry. She was responsible for the well-being of those who remained in her home. She would prepare meals for them, provide transportation for them if they required it, and she would frequently stay up late, simply listening to their expressions of anger and providing a shoulder to weep on when they were not given a part that they desired. A significant number of her previous tenants who went on to achieve enormous success in the entertainment industry would later claim that the time they spent with Kathy at the villa was, at the very least, partially responsible for their achievement. When they thought back on it, they recalled it as a moment that was therapeutic and relaxing, a quiet in the storm that was the industry. In spite of the fact that Johnny had already achieved his major success, he was enamored with the concept of residing in such a tranquil location, a location that appeared to be geared toward eccentric and artistic individuals just like him. As a result, Johnny called Kathy in April of 2009 and inquired as to whether or not she had a room available. Obviously, she stated that it was a given. There is a crimson suite on the 2nd floor that you are welcome to stay in. Following his move into the writer's villa, Johnny shared with his pals that it exceeded his expectations in terms of its level of awe and wonder. Furthermore, Kathy, in particular, lived up to the expectations that had been set by everyone. The elderly landlady and he became fast friends almost immediately after meeting each other. For a period of time, it appeared that everything was going according to Johnny's plan. His life was heading in the direction that he truly desired it to go. His life then took an unexpected turn just a few months later, but that was not the case. The news that his girlfriend, Diane, was expecting a child came to him. Johnny was truly pleased at the prospect of being a father, despite the fact that this entirely altered his intentions for finishing his work. In a responsible manner, he made the decision to act. He left the tranquil villa and moved in with Diane, who lived in the neighborhood, so that he could be present to assist with the care of their child. In the year 2010, on April 6th, Diane gave birth to a healthy baby girl whom they called Culame. This occurred 9 months subsequently. Upon the birth of their daughter, Johnny and Diane fell head over heels in love with her. Unfortuitously, the pressures of fatherhood caused their love for each other to diminish rapidly, which negatively impacted their relationship. Within a short period of time, their relationship had deteriorated to the point where Johnny decided to leave, and this time he went back to live with his parents. Johnny and Diane were involved in a custody battle over their daughter, Culame, that was extremely violent, drawn out, and excruciating. This conflict began not long after the collapse of their relationship. Johnny was ultimately unsuccessful in the fight, which lasted for several months. He was completely and utterly devastated by the verdict that the court made. Around a few months later, in October of 2011, Johnny was still residing at his parents' home, and he was experiencing feelings of disorientation and depression. For the sole purpose of going for a ride and attempting to get his thoughts organized, he made the decision to ride his motorcycle one day. To the west of Los Angeles, he traveled for around 2 hours, and then he continued on into the desert. It was at that moment that he lost control of his motorcycle and came to a crash. He was transported to the hospital, where it was initially discovered that his injuries were not quite as severe as one might expect. The medical professionals were a little worried that he might have suffered a brain injury, but after conducting a series of tests, they found that he did not have a concussion. He was released home after they assured him that he was fine. Nevertheless, he was not in good health when he returned home from the hospital. As a matter of fact, he was an entirely different individual. Michael, Johnny's father, was the first person to pick up on the significant behavioral shift that his son had undergone. Johnny has recently appeared to be behaving in a really strange and irregular manner. In addition to being agitated and irritable all the time, his thoughts were not always cohesive, he would ramble, and he couldn't stop talking. The fact that something was gravely wrong was so clear to his family that they couldn't ignore it. Michael, his father, was perplexed by this information. It is possible that his son sustained a head injury as a result of the motorcycle accident. Maybe the medical staff at the hospital simply failed to notice it. After that, Michael made arrangements for Johnny to have 2 independent MRIs so that he could get a better look at his brain. But Johnny did not show up for either of his appointments, and he never provided an explanation for his decision. Approximately at the same time, Johnny's pals started to take notice of his peculiar behavior themselves. In December of that year, he was attending an acting class, and throughout the entirety of the session, he began speaking with an accent that was reminiscent of British. Every single person in the classroom appeared to be staring at each other as if they were perplexed by the situation. In the end, someone finally confronted him with the question, "Hey, why are you talking like that, In a state of bewilderment, Johnny simply stared at them and asked, "Like what?" In response, he simply shrugged his shoulders and pretended as if he had no idea what they were talking about. The situation became far more dire a few weeks later, on the morning of the 3rd of January 2012, when it was at its peak. Johnny was at his parents' house, where he was observing his mother as she prepared omelets. He was seated in the kitchen. The sudden appearance of Johnny, who suddenly rose up and announced, "I'm going to go out for a walk," came out of nowhere. He stands up, and the only thing he is wearing is his pajamas. He is not even wearing shoes at this point. He exits the house by the front door, and as he is heading down the road, he is approximately 10 to 15 feet away from his parents' residence. At that point, he claims to have heard someone yelling something that sounded like they were in a great deal of anguish. It occurred to him that the screams were emanating from an apartment that was situated just adjacent to the residence of his parents. In light of this, he did not hesitate before breaking into the apartment. Upon entering, however, he saw that there was no one present. Not a single person was present in the residence. At the very moment when he was standing in this vacant flat, completely bewildered, the 2 guys who owned the unit returned home. When they entered, they saw Johnny standing in the living room, and he was there alone. They informed him that he was required to leave without delay. However, rather than making his departure, Johnny did something that was entirely unexpected. He then charged at them, bashing both of them over the head with the bottle. However, they were able to tackle him, detain him, and hold him down until the police arrived. He then grabbed a glass bottle that was nearby and charged at them. Johnny claimed that he was acting in self-defense when he was questioned by the police, but the police did not believe his account for a single second. Trespassing, burglary, and assault with a deadly weapon were the charges that were brought against him, and he was taken custody of and placed in jail. A total of 8 exhausting days had passed by the time Johnny's father was eventually able to post bail and release his son from jail. The condition of Johnny had deteriorated during the course of those 8 days. The general population portion of the jail had been moved to the psychiatric unit, and he had been transferred there. The security personnel reported that he was beating his head against the concrete walls of his cell on a regular basis. He had attempted to leap off a balcony that was located on the 2nd floor at one time. He was simply behaving in a manner that was utterly out of control. As a result, a physician working at the correctional facility had left a statement on his paperwork when he was ultimately released from jail. Based on his observations, the physician stated that he was of the opinion that Johnny must have sustained some kind of head injury at some point in time, which was the reason for his behavior. The physician also made the observation that Johnny was unquestionably suicidal. Johnny was a complete and utter mess when he arrived at his parents' place after it had been a long time. The battle that he had with the two men in the flat had left him with two black eyes, and his face was swollen and bruised as a result of the altercation that he had with them. The emotional turmoil he was experiencing was so severe that he would not allow any member of his family to even come close to him. The only thing he did was lock himself in his room and tell everyone to not come near him. A heightened sensitivity to light was another symptom that he had. The situation became so dire that he began walking around his parents' house and shutting out each and every light individually. As soon as his parents eventually turned them back on, he would become upset and angry, and then he would go and turn them all off completely again. At long last, in a moment of exasperation, he walked to the fuse box that belonged to his parents and just turned off the power completely, therefore putting the entire house into full darkness. Nevertheless, in spite of the fact that Johnny had very visible problems after returning home from jail, it appeared that he was making some progress over the course of the subsequent few weeks. Despite the fact that it was a gradual process, there were times when he appeared to be more like his previous self. His parents believed that he had made sufficient progress by the time the month of January came to a close, over a month after he had returned home, and they gave him permission to move out and live on his own once more. It took him around 30 minutes to travel to Santa Monica, California, where he discovered a place to stay. However, as soon as he moved out on his own, he began to experience difficulties once more to a greater extent. On the 10th of February, he was arrested for striking a random stranger in the head outside of a yogurt shop. This occurred only about a week after he had moved into his new house in Santa Monica. Under the terms of a bail of $20,000, he was released. After a number of days had passed, Johnny simply walked into the ocean while wearing all of his clothes. It was necessary for strangers to rescue him from the icy water, and he was then transported to the hospital to receive treatment for hypothermia upon his arrival. The second time he was taken into custody came just a few days after he had been released from the hospital. For the second time, he was apprehended while attempting to break into the apartment of a woman in Santa Monica. When he was apprehended by the authorities, he stated that he had considered the apartment to be that of his friend. However, once again, nobody believed him. Again, he was taken back to jail, and then he was released on bond before being released. Johnny's parents were finally successful in persuading him to schedule an appointment with a medical professional regarding the possible head injury they believed he had sustained as a result of the motorbike accident that occurred in 2011. This second arrest took place in Santa Monica. However, despite the fact that the doctor at the jailhouse had speculated that Johnny had sustained a head injury, he had not officially diagnosed him. Johnny needed the assistance of a second physician in order to receive a definitive diagnosis, which would allow them to finally start treating whatever ailment he was experiencing. However, the physician that Johnny ultimately went to see had a different point of view. A brain injury was not anything he suspected. As an alternative, he had a strong suspicion that Johnny was suffering from either schizophrenia or bipolar illness, both of which are quite severe mental conditions. The result was that he gave Johnny a prescription for a potent drug that would treat both of those illnesses, and then he sent Johnny on his way. Still, Johnny was adamant about not taking the prescription. His rejection was complete. In addition to this, he declined to get a second opinion from a different physician. Due to the fact that he was not receiving any therapy, his condition continued to deteriorate. There was still a significant possibility that Johnny would be sentenced to jail for the break-in and the assault that he committed against those two men in the flat that was adjacent to his parents' house. His attorney was exerting a great deal of effort in an effort to negotiate a plea bargain for Johnny in which he would be sentenced to a year of therapy at a mental health hospital rather than being sent to jail. Johnny, however, was so naive in his belief that all of the accusations would simply be dropped and that he would be let to return to his life and live the way he desired, that he decided to terminate his attorney. It was his decision to act as his own attorney in court. It turned out to be a really bad choice. His sentence of 1 year in prison was handed down by the judge, and the charges against him were not withdrawn. However, because the facility to which he was sent was so badly overcrowded, they ultimately decided to reduce his sentence to merely 6 weeks for the whole duration of his sentence. Johnny was at an all-time low when his father finally came to pick him up from prison on Friday, the 21st of September 2012. Johnny's father had been incarcerated for years. Despite the fact that he had only been incarcerated for a period of 6 weeks, rather than the entire year that he had been sentenced to, it was evident that the small amount of time that he had spent in jail had caused him a great deal of personal harm. He was emaciated, reserved, and appeared to be in rudimentary condition. Johnny turned to his father in a kind of bashful manner as they were driving back from the prison. He asked his father, "You know, Dad, would it be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa?" Johnny's father nodded his head in agreement. "I just wanted to check and see if there was any possibility that I could move back in." It was Michael, his father, who gave it some thought for a brief while. It was something he hadn't thought about before, yet it made complete sense. The writer's villa was the final residence that Johnny had occupied during the time that his life was still in order. Most likely, that was the very last place in which he felt genuine happiness. He must have associated that location with a great deal of pleasant and tranquil recollection. It was a wonderful concept, Michael thought, and it was the ideal location for him to go to in order to make an effort to put his life back together. Michael immediately placed a phone call to Kathy Davis as soon as they returned to the house. After describing the entire scenario and everything that Johnny had been through, he inquired as to whether or not there was any possibility that he could remain there. And without a single second of doubt, Kathy responded with an unequivocal yes. "It is still possible to purchase the red suite. Immediately, I will walk up to the bedroom and make the bed for him. I can't wait to meet him in person." Johnny spent the weekend with his parents, and then on Monday, September 24th, he moved back into the villa after packing up his belongings and moving back in with them. 2 days later, on the morning of September 26th, a man named Dan Blackburn, who was the next-door neighbor to the writer's villa property, was looking out his front window. Blackburn was 70 years old at the time. Along the route, he noticed a man who was standing out. The only thing the man was wearing was a pair of red sneakers and a pair of trousers. He was furiously pacing back and forth in the center of the street, he was completely drenched in sweat, and he was not wearing a shirt by any stretch of the imagination. Dan had never encountered this individual before, and his conduct was peculiar. So he just kind of watched him from behind his curtain, attempting to figure out what he was going to do next. Following around 15 minutes of this peculiar and anxious pacing in the road, the man abruptly turned and walked directly towards Dan's property where he had been standing. After walking straight up to the front steps, he began to knock on the door while he was there. In spite of the fact that Dan was feeling a little anxious, he went ahead and closed the curtain, then went to his front door and peered through the peephole into his home. The man was standing there when he noticed him. He had these brilliant blue eyes that were wide open, and he was staring at the peephole as if he could see Dan standing on the other side of it. He appeared to be able to see through it. After taking a deep breath, Dan unlocked the door and opened it slightly. He then opened it a little bit more. When he looked out, the person who was standing outside greeted him and introduced himself as John. "Hello, I am your new neighbor." It was inevitable that John would be revealed to be Johnny Lewis on the subject. The door was opened a little bit farther by Dan, who was attempting to be sociable. He then added, "Hello, John, it's nice to meet you." However, before the two men could engage in any type of genuine discourse, Johnny quickly turned around and walked away without saying a single word. At this point, Dan is left standing there, very perplexed by the peculiar interaction that he has just experienced. He observes Johnny as he simply walks back to the road, then walks back over to the writer's villa, enters the building, and then vanishes from view. In a manner that could be described as a shrug, Dan decided to close and lock his door before returning to his morning routine. Dan is in another area of his house, simply doing his own thing, when he hears his wife outside, yelling his name and urging him to come outside immediately. This happens around 30 minutes later. As soon as Dan exits the main door, he dashes into his driveway, which is the area that separates his property from the writer's villa. He notices his wife standing on the driveway, and she appears to be in complete and utter disbelief. In the direction of the back of their house, she is pointing upward. While Dan is looking in the direction that she is pointing, he notices Johnny Lewis standing close to their deck. A second man, the worker that Dan and his wife had hired that day to paint their back deck, is standing on top of Johnny. Johnny is standing on their back. This guy is getting a never-ending stream of blows from Johnny. He also has a piece of wood in his possession, which he is using to strike him. The unfortunate worker is currently lying on the ground, attempting to protect himself from the blood that is running down his body. It was just that Dan's instincts took control. He makes his way over to them. Due to the fact that Johnny is so intent on the assault, he has failed to notice Dan coming closer. Dan immediately approaches him, grabs him by the shoulder, and makes an attempt to remove Johnny from the painter's grasp all at once. Johnny is being yelled at by him to stop himself and to get off of him. On the other hand, Johnny appears to be completely unmoved. Just like a machine, he is destroying this worker from the inside out. When Dan finally pulls as hard as he can on Johnny's shoulder, Johnny finally jumps up and stands up right away. After turning around, he delivers a single punch to Dan's face, bringing him to the same level as before. Dan suffers a severe fall to the ground. Johnny is simply standing over him and looking down at him with no expression on his face. When he glances up, he sees Johnny standing over him. It appeared as though he had no idea what he was going to do with Dan in the next instance. He did nothing but stand there and stare with those eyes that were so big and vacant. On the other hand, Dan was not going to squander any time in his attempt to figure it out. Immediately after jumping back up to his feet, he struck Johnny with as much force as he could muster, delivering a blow to the side of his skull. On the other hand, Johnny was completely unaffected by the punch. At no point did he even flinch. Simply staring at Dan without making any facial expressions, he continued to look. Therefore, Dan, in a state of panic, grabbed a metal lawn chair that was nearby, and he nearly shattered it over Johnny's head to get him to sit down. Once again, however, it had little impact. Johnny did nothing but stand there, staring at Dan without forming any expression on his face. At this time, Dan was aware that he was doing nothing to win this fight. Therefore, he simply grabbed the painter, who was so weak that he could not stand up, and he assisted him in running back down the driveway. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them rushed in the direction of their home in order to go inside and be safe. The three of them were able to make their way into the house, and just as they were attempting to close the large and massive front door, Johnny came running up the stairs. At precisely the moment that they were closing the door, he arrived at the door and pushed his arm into the gap that existed between the door and the doorframe. For some reason, they were unable to shut the door because it was getting caught on his arm. So at this point, all three of the adults inside, Dan, his wife, and the injured painter, are exerting all of their combined weight on this enormous wooden door in an attempt to crush Johnny's arm. However, Johnny is only attempting to grab at them through the opening. Finally, the three of them begin to heave the door back and slam it onto Johnny's arm as forcefully as they possibly can, repeatedly. They do this over and over again. Johnny was finally able to retract his arm after being subjected to a series of powerful strikes that were crushing, and they were able to slam the door shut and lock it. It was at this time that Dan's wife and the painter went throughout the remainder of the house, making sure that every window was shut and every door was locked. They wanted to ensure that there was no other way for him to enter the house. While this was going on, Dan moved to a side window that had a view of the writer's villa property. While his eyes searched the yard for Johnny, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. He was currently hunting for Johnny. The moment he finishes explaining what is going on to the 911 operator and hangs up, Johnny suddenly materializes out of nowhere. The way he is rushing down Dan's driveway gives the impression that he is heading back towards the back deck. At that moment, however, he comes to a stop practically just in front of the window that Dan is seeing out of. He makes a turn and immediately begins to run at full speed in the direction of the villa property. When he reaches a barrier that is at least waist high, he simply leaps over it without pausing his stride in any way. After that, he arrives to this enormous wooden fence that encircled the entire area owned by the villa. This fence stood at a height of at least 8, 9, and possibly 10 feet. In a very simple and straightforward manner, he simply leaps, grabs the top, and launches himself directly over the top, vanishing within the confines of the villa's grounds. The police arrived within a few minutes of the call. In an effort to locate Johnny, they proceeded inside the villa, and the things that they discovered there were beyond their comprehension. These are the events that the investigators believe took place that morning based on the evidence that was found at the scene. Johnny had turned around after he had initially approached Dan's property and awkwardly knocked on the door, introducing himself as the new neighbor. He had then introduced himself to Dan. Dan watched him as he walked away from the grounds and made his way back inside the writer's villa while he was there. The moment Johnny entered the villa, he made his way to the second story where he entered Kathy Davis's room where she was at the time. Johnny then proceeded to the second floor. The compassionate woman, Kathy, who was 81 years old, most likely turned around and spotted Johnny standing in the doorway of her home. It appeared as though he was completely insane since he was drenched in sweat and he was not wearing a shirt. On the other hand, she most likely did not feel terrified at first. It is likely that her maternal instincts came into play. She most likely asked Johnny, "Are you okay?" or anything along those lines. "Is it possible for me to assist you? How are things going?" And while she was probably standing up and making her way over to him to make sure he was okay, Johnny proceeded to beat her, kick her, and strangle her for reasons that no one will ever understand. He did this for reasons that no one will ever understand. And then, once she had fallen to the ground and was completely defenseless, Johnny proceeded to either continuously stamp on her skull or hit her over the head with a rusty hammer that was subsequently discovered in his bedroom. Both of these actions were carried out in a manner that was quite violent. But regardless of the specific manner in which Johnny carried out his actions, he was able to cause a major fracture to her skull, which was eventually the cause of her death. Following his murder of Kathy, Johnny immediately went in search of her cherished cat and proceeded to kill the cat in the same heinous manner. After that, Johnny raced out of the villa, and it was at that moment that he must have seen Dan's house painter sitting outside doing nothing but minding his own business. While Johnny was walking over to him, he immediately started pounding him. In the same way that the awful attack on Kathy and her cat appeared to have no reason whatsoever, this attack on the house painter appeared to have no reason at all. It was utterly arbitrary and made no sense at all. Johnny waited outside for a few minutes before running down Dan's driveway after Dan came outside and was able to fight off Johnny. After Dan went back inside the home with his wife and the painter, Johnny then ran down Dan's driveway. Following that, he jumped over those two fences just in front of Dan, and then Johnny vanished back inside the villa. It is believed that once Johnny was back inside the villa property, he climbed up to an upper patio or possibly onto the roof of the villa where he was staying. From that vantage point, he proceeded to either jump or fall to his death on the concrete driveway that was located below. It has been determined that his death was not a suicide, but rather an accident. Everyone who heard the story concluded that Johnny must have been under the influence of some extremely potent narcotics after the word broke about what had occurred at the writer's villa. When it came to explaining why someone would behave in such a manner with such excessive, unjustified aggression and what appeared to be superhuman strength, that seemed to be the only plausible answer. However, the toxicology result provided by the coroner's office revealed that he did not possess any drugs, whether they were legal or illicit, in his system. This was the case regardless of the type of substance. At the time that he did this heinous murder, he was absolutely free of any alcohol or drugs. Because of the motorbike accident, there are some individuals, including his family, who are of the opinion that Johnny actually did suffer from a significant head injury that was not properly diagnosed. They are of the opinion that this brain injury is the cause of his violent outbursts, as well as the entire transformation of his personality. There are those that disagree. People believe that the head damage explanation does not adequately explain everything. They are of the opinion that Johnny had a mental condition that was not properly diagnosed. It's possible that it was schizophrenia, or it could have been bipolar disorder, or it could have been something else different. However, this mental condition was the root cause of the psychosis that resulted in these violent outbursts among the individuals. No one, however, is able to definitively explain why Johnny Lewis acted in the manner that he did. The only thing that we know for certain is that a woman who was nice and innocent, as well as her beloved pet, has been cruelly and needlessly murdered, and that a story that started out with Hollywood hopes has ended up being a nightmare that cannot be explained. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the evening of the 3rd of June, 2004, a 23-year-old college junior named Jesse Valencia walked into a restaurant in Columbia, Missouri, carrying far more stress than he let show on his face. Just days earlier, Jesse had stood in a courtroom expecting a minor charge from a college house party to quietly disappear. Instead, prosecutors escalated the case, leaving him suddenly facing a much more serious offense. But if you had looked at Jesse that night, you never would have guessed any of that. The moment he spotted his friends waving from a table in the back of the restaurant, his expression shifted into the same easy smile everyone knew him for. Jesse was the kind of person who seemed impossible to intimidate. He was studying journalism and pre-law at the University of Missouri, juggling classes, work, parties, and an enormous social circle all at once. Friends described him as magnetic, outgoing, fearless, and always searching for excitement. Even after the stressful court hearing, Jesse refused to let it ruin the beginning of his summer break. School was finally out, and for the first time in months, he wanted to forget about deadlines, legal trouble, and uncertainty about the future. He just wanted one carefree night with friends. But beneath that confident exterior, Jesse's life had quietly become much more complicated than most people around him realized. The court case was only one problem among many. His recent breakup had left him emotionally spiraling, his finances were falling apart, and over the past few weeks, he had started spending time with someone he absolutely should not have been involved with. It was the kind of secret that could destroy careers, relationships, and lives if it ever became public. And before the weekend was over, that secret would leave Jesse Valencia dead on a patch of grass just blocks away from campus. And so, as soon as he sat down at the table with his friends, one of them immediately asked him about it. They said, "Hey, how did that court hearing go the other day?" And Jesse just shook his head and said it didn't go too well. He told them he thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous. He really had hoped the charge would have been dropped by now. But when he had gone into the courtroom, he found out the charge had actually been upgraded, not downgraded. The prosecutor had changed it to obstructing a government operation by physical interference, which was a more serious offense. But Jesse told his friends he still wasn't that worried about it. He said he had pleaded not guilty, and his plan was to fight this thing all the way to the end, even if it took the entire summer. The thing was, this charge, this court case, was actually the least of Jesse's problems at that moment. He had much bigger, much heavier things weighing on his mind that summer. His longtime boyfriend, a man named Jack Barry, had broken up with him recently. And Jesse was having a very, very hard time coping with it. It was one of those breakups where one person is completely done and the other person is still holding on. Jack had said he wanted to stay friends, but the reality was, even though the intention behind it was probably good, it just made everything harder for Jesse. Because they were trying to be friends, it meant that Jesse and Jack were still spending a fair amount of time together. They were still talking and socializing in the same circles. And while Jack felt like things were definitively over romantically, Jesse didn't feel that way at all. For him, it just sort of felt like they were perpetually on the verge of getting back together, even when all the signs pointed to that not being true. And then, whenever Jesse would try to talk to Jack about maybe making things work again, trying to give the relationship another shot, Jack would immediately and gently but firmly turn him down. The whole situation was just a constant cycle of hope and rejection, and it was really taking a toll on him. So, without Jack in his life as a partner anymore, Jesse had become incredibly lonely. He had been trying to fill that void with random hookups. He was meeting guys online and sometimes inviting them back to the hotel where he worked as a night clerk. But for the most part, it was all very shallow. It didn't mean anything to him, and it wasn't what he was looking for. For a little while, Jesse had been having this secret affair with an older man, which had been exciting in a forbidden kind of way. But deep down, what Jesse really wanted was a real, committed relationship, something like what he thought he had had with Jack. And these random, fleeting encounters were just not cutting it. And so, at this point in his life, basically every time Jesse went out socially, no matter what he was doing or who he was with, he was always kind of on the hunt. He was always scanning the room, looking for somebody who could potentially have long-term relationship potential. And this night, this dinner with his friends, was no exception. That night, Jesse and his friends had a nice long dinner together. They talked and laughed, and when they were all done, they left the restaurant and walked a few blocks down the street to a popular gay dance club called the Sioux Club. Inside, the place was dark, the air was thick with energy, and the music was loud and thumping. As soon as they walked inside, Jesse immediately weaved his way through the crowd on the dance floor and made a beeline straight for the DJ booth. He leaned over and asked the DJ to play his favorite song, which was Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. The DJ just sort of rolled their eyes and gave a little sigh. Jesse knew the DJ was probably annoyed with him. He was a regular here, and he requested that exact same song every single time he came to this club. But Jesse had never let other people's opinions stop him from doing what he wanted. He didn't care if the DJ was annoyed. He just wanted to hear his song. After he had made his request, Jesse went over to the bar and ordered a drink. And while he was waiting for the bartender, he saw a young man standing all by himself at the other end of the bar. Once the bartender passed Jesse his drink, Jesse took a sip and then walked over to the man. He smiled and asked him if he wanted to dance. The man smiled back and said, "Sure." And so one dance turned into two, and then two turned into three. And pretty soon, the two of them had spent the whole night on the dance floor together. It was hard to hear each other over the loud music, but over the course of several dances and shouting into each other's ears, Jesse had learned that this man's name was Ed McDevitt, and he was in town training to be a chef. Jesse felt like Ed was a really nice, cool guy, and it seemed like they had an immediate and genuine connection. And so, when the club finally closed for the night, Jesse asked Ed if he wanted to come home with him. Ed said yes. After that, Jesse found his friend Jennifer and asked if she wouldn't mind giving them a ride back to his apartment. She said, of course. And so, shortly after that, the trio left the club. They got into Jennifer's car, and she drove them back to Jesse's apartment building. When Jesse and Ed got out of the car, Jennifer leaned over from the driver's seat and said, "Hey, tomorrow night I'm having a party at my place. You two should come by." And Jesse, he turned to Ed and kind of winked at him and said, "Yeah, hopefully we'll both be there." And then Jennifer smiled and drove off into the night. After Jennifer was gone, Jesse walked Ed down the short flight of stairs to his very run-down basement apartment. And as soon as they went inside, Ed was confronted with this sea of books. There were stacks of history books all over the living room, on shelves, on the floor, on the coffee table. It turned out Jesse was really into ancient Greek history. And so Ed began walking around, picking them up, opening these old worn history books. And as Ed did that, Jesse began to regale him with tales of the Battle of Thermopylae, explaining how the small force of Spartans were so dramatically outnumbered, but how they held their ground. He talked about Zeus and the other ancient Greek gods, and he was just kind of going off on all the stuff that Jesse really loved and was passionate about. And Ed, as he listened to him, just said, I really don't know much about history, but it's really fascinating that you're so into it. From there, the rest of the night went great for the two of them. They would end up spending the night together. And then, at about 10 o'clock the next morning, as Ed was getting ready to leave, they made plans to meet up again at Jennifer's party that night. Before Ed left, he wrote his phone number down on a scrap piece of paper and he gave it to Jesse. And Jesse took the paper, and then he walked Ed to the door and gave him a hug and a kiss before he left. And then, once Ed was gone, Jesse closed the door and just leaned against it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be just another meaningless hookup. Maybe this had the potential to be the start of a strong, long-term relationship, the one thing Jesse really, truly wanted. Around noon that day, Jesse was in his kitchen eating a quick lunch before he had to head out for work when he heard a sharp knock on his door. He walked over and opened it up, and he saw his landlord standing in the hallway. And his landlord looked pretty mad. He told Jesse that, hey, it's the 4th of the month, and you still haven't paid this month's rent. Jesse apologized profusely and just said, it totally slipped his mind. And he promised he would get the money to the landlord that afternoon. But after the landlord accepted his answer and left, and Jesse shut the door, he couldn't help but have this sort of sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Because the truth was, he didn't have the money for rent. Jesse had grown up in a very poor family in a small town in Kentucky. He was actually the first person in his entire family to go to college. And he was paying his own bills by working as a hotel clerk, the same job his mother had had back home. Now, Jesse loved his family, and he spoke to them on the phone basically every single day. He would call them all the time. But at the same time, he had always felt so trapped in his conservative, ultra-religious hometown. So he had left, and he had tried to sort of reinvent himself as someone new, the kind of person who could do anything and go anywhere. But even though he had done that, it would turn out that making real money was something that he just hadn't quite figured out how to do yet. Before Jesse left for work that afternoon, he scrounged up all the cash he could find in his apartment, but it still wasn't enough to make the full rent payment. He dropped the cash he did have in the landlord's mailbox anyway, along with a little note promising that he would get the rest of it together in a couple of weeks. Then he walked to his job at the campus inn and spent a pretty uneventful evening behind the front desk, just counting down the hours until the end of his shift. And as soon as the clock struck 11 p.m., he bolted out of the hotel and hurried home. He immediately changed his clothes and then headed right back out to Jennifer's party, where he was supposed to meet his new love interest, Ed McDevitt. However, when Jesse walked into that party, he scanned the crowd, but he didn't see Ed. He did a full lap around the apartment, checking every room, but he wasn't there. And so Jesse just grabbed a beer out of the fridge and started chatting with Jennifer while he waited, hoping Ed was just running late. But after a while, he checked his watch and realized that either Ed was running really, really late, or he just wasn't coming at all. So trying to tell himself that it wasn't quite time to be disappointed yet, maybe there was a simple explanation for this, Jesse went outside to the porch and he called the phone number that Ed had written down on that piece of paper that morning. Now, this phone number was for a landline phone. And so, Jesse, he punched it in and he listened. It rang for a few beats, and then somebody picked up. It was a guy's voice, but it was not Ed. It was somebody whose name was Mark Butler. And, Jesse had never heard of this guy. And he asked, where's Ed? And Mark explained that he was Ed's roommate. And that actually, Ed was asleep right now. He had to work early in the morning, and so he had decided not to go to Jennifer's party. He just wanted to get some sleep. Now, as Mark was telling him this, Jesse was trying to make sense of the situation. Like, okay, is Mark Ed's boyfriend or something? Are they together? Or are they really just roommates? And also, Jesse couldn't help but feel like Mark clearly did not want to be talking to him right now. It was pretty obvious from his tone that he was trying to just get off the phone as quickly as possible. But Jesse was not ready to just give up. He really wanted to see Ed. And so he told Mark, "Well, hold on a minute. Can you please just go wake him up? I really need to talk to him." And at first, Mark was like, "No, he's asleep. He has to work in the morning. Like, he does not want me waking him up." But Jesse was relentless. He just kept pushing, begging Mark to please, just for a second, put Ed on the phone. And eventually, after what felt like a long time, Mark relented with a heavy sigh. About a minute later, a very groggy-sounding Ed hopped on the phone. And as soon as Jesse heard his voice, he was so excited. He basically launched into this big pitch, telling Ed all the reasons why he should not go to bed and why he should come out to this party, and that he really, really wanted to see him again. And also, he added, "Hey, bring your friend Mark too." That was fine with him. Now, it's not really clear if Ed was all that excited about this idea, but he would eventually say, "Fine, I'll come out and meet you, and I will bring Mark." When they got there, Mark would only stay at Jennifer's party for a little while before he headed out on his own. But Ed and Jesse, they would stick around until about 2 a.m. And then, at that point, they would leave Jennifer's house and go to another party that was happening right across the street. At around 3 a.m., though, Ed said he really did have to get going. It was so late, and he had to get up for work in the morning. Like, he really had to go this time. And so, at this point, Jesse understood that this was reasonable. And so he walked him out to the sidewalk, and then he asked him, "Hey, do you want to come over to my place?" But Ed said, "No, really. I have to get home. I have to go to bed." However, before Ed did finally leave, the two of them would make plans to see each other again in just a couple of days. After Ed had taken off, Jesse wandered back across the street to say goodbye to Jennifer. And then, after that, he began making the short walk back to his own apartment. And as he was walking through the quiet, dark streets, he began to think that he really didn't want to go home alone. If Ed didn't want to come over, well, he was going to find somebody else who would. And so his first thought was to call his ex, Jack. So Jesse pulled out his phone and called Jack a few times. And when Jack did not pick up, which after all, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and they are no longer in a relationship, it's sort of reasonable that he wouldn't answer, but Jesse still wanted to see him. And so he walked a few blocks out of his way to make an actual stop at Jack's apartment building. Jesse went right up to the front door and he banged on it, but nobody came to the door. Jack didn't answer. At this point, standing on Jack's dark doorstep, Jesse began to wonder if maybe Jack was out with somebody else right now. And he suddenly felt this sharp pang of jealousy. Or worse, maybe Jack was in there, and he knew that Jesse was outside, but he just didn't want to see him and was intentionally ignoring him. After a couple of minutes of standing there and knocking a few more times and still not hearing anything from inside, Jesse finally gave up. He stumbled back towards his own apartment, drunk and lonely and feeling a bit heartbroken. Jesse finally stepped foot inside his apartment and shut the door behind him at about 3:45 a.m. However, right after he had gotten undressed and flopped down onto his bed, he heard a knock at his front door. At 2 p.m. the following day, which was Saturday, the 5th of June, 2004, a college student walked out of an apartment just down the street from Jesse's building. He was carrying a backpack and a cooler. His friends had just pulled up in the parking lot, and they were all about to head out for a weekend trip to St. Louis. But while he was loading his stuff into the trunk of the car, he noticed somebody lying in the grass nearby, wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. Now, at first, he just assumed, this was probably just somebody who had passed out drunk from a crazy Friday night party, which sort of happened all the time in a college town like Columbia. But when he took a few steps closer just to be sure this person was okay, he saw flies buzzing around their body. About 30 minutes later, Columbia Police Detective John Short felt his pager go off. He unclipped it from his belt loop, and he saw there was a message from his boss's phone number that just read 911. Detective Short called his boss right away, and he was given the address for a crime scene just off the University of Missouri campus. Short drove there, parked his car on the curb, and then he walked over to the yellow tape that was keeping a growing crowd of worried neighbors away from the scene. Another detective, Tim Geiger, waved to Short and led him over to the patch of grass where the victim was lying. There was a young man, sprawled out on his back, and he was wearing a pair of light blue running shorts. He had no shoes, no socks, and no shirt. And stretched across his throat was this very deep, very clean gash. The medical examiner was already there, and she was crouched down next to the body. She looked up at Detective Short and told him that a few things were already standing out to her. She pointed to the bruises that were all over the victim's face, on their arms, and across their torso. But then, when she carefully lifted the victim's hands, she showed Short that there were no defensive wounds on them at all. She told him that that was pretty unusual for a knife attack. Usually, victims would get their hands up, trying to defend themselves, and as a result, they would get their hands and arms cut up in the process. She also pointed out that the blood had run down both sides of the victim's neck and had pooled in the grass under his body, but there was no blood at all on the front of his body. This meant he was probably already lying down right there in the grass when his throat actually got cut. Finally, the medical examiner gently pulled back the victim's eyelids and showed Detective Short the tiny hemorrhages in his eyes, which they both knew was typically a sign of strangulation. And so, putting all these pieces together, Short theorized that, the victim's killer had likely choked him out first, rendering him unconscious, and then had laid him out on the grass. And then, they had slit his throat while he was laying there, helpless and unable to defend himself. The detective looked down at his victim's bare feet and noticed they were covered in dirt and grass stains like he had been running at some point outside. Short doubted that the encounter between his victim and the killer began right there on the lawn where the body was found. And now he just wondered if maybe there had been some sort of a chase here and that this patch of grass was just where the killer had finally caught up to the victim. But since there was no ID on the victim, Short had no idea who he was or where he might have been running from. And so, Short stood up and stepped away from the body so the crime scene techs could carefully load it into a body bag. Just then, another squad car pulled up, and two more officers got out. It was Sergeant Kenneth Smith and Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was the beat cop who typically patrolled this specific neighborhood. So another sergeant who was already on the scene had radioed for him to come over and see if maybe he could help identify the victim. And so at this point, Short told the crime scene techs to go ahead and unzip the body bag and let Officer Rios take a look. Rios came over and he leaned down and he looked inside. And after just a second, he nodded and said that he did recognize this young man. He said it was a college kid that he had actually arrested at a house party just a couple of months ago. He said his name was Jesse Valencia. And so, less than an hour into his investigation, Detective Short now had a name for his victim and some pretty good initial theories about how his victim was killed. His next task, and it was a big one, was figuring out who in the world might have wanted Jesse Valencia dead. So Short immediately looked up Jesse's address and he found that his apartment building was only a single block away from the crime scene. So he walked over there. And while the forensics team went inside the apartment to look for evidence, another officer was posted outside the building to make sure no one came or went until the crime scene was officially cleared and processed. Short walked into the building and headed down the stairs to Jesse's basement unit. And there, the crime scene tech who was dusting the doorway for prints told him that when they had first arrived, the door to the apartment was actually already open. So Short went inside the unit and he began looking around. There was no blood anywhere, and nothing was broken or overturned. So there was no clear sign of a struggle inside the apartment itself, but the door being left wide open suggested that Jesse must have left in a real hurry. And this certainly matched Short's theory about the fight between Jesse and this killer starting in one location and then ending out on that lawn. Short figured that, Jesse must have run out of his apartment in a panic and made it a block away to that patch of grass before his killer finally overtook him. And so as Short began to consider this, he also started to think, okay, well, Jesse, who appeared to be in reasonably good shape for his age, if he was chased down and tackled and killed only a block away from his apartment, it sort of suggested that his killer was likely pretty strong and pretty fast. So he was probably looking for somebody who was in relatively good physical shape. That's the killer. At least that's the profile he was starting to develop in his mind. And also, the way that Jesse was actually killed, having his throat cut open so violently, it just seemed incredibly personal. Which suggested that whoever killed Jesse was likely somebody that Jesse actually knew. And so, with that in mind, Short finished a sweep of Jesse's apartment, and then he asked a crime scene tech to prioritize getting access to the cell phone and the computer that he saw sitting on Jesse's desk. Then he walked out of the apartment and across the hall to the door of Jesse's closest neighbor, and he knocked. A moment later, a very confused-looking young man poked his head out and asked Short what was going on. Short told him that he was investigating a murder, and he wanted to ask him a few questions. The young man at first just seemed totally shocked and appalled to be hearing this. But then, it was like this look of dawning realization washed over his face. He told Short that the previous night he had actually been woken up by the sound of what was very clearly two grown men fighting in Jesse's apartment. And one of those men was definitely Jesse, because this neighbor heard Jesse clearly saying over and over again, "No," and "Stop it," to this other man. Now, the neighbor kind of sheepishly admitted that, he didn't actually do anything about this at the time. He actually just kind of banged on his own wall and yelled, "Hey, stop it over there." And then shortly after that, the noise had stopped, and the neighbor had kind of forgotten all about it and had gone back to sleep, not realizing that what he was likely hearing was the beginning of Jesse's murder. The neighbor told Short that when he had woken up that afternoon, he had actually gone across the hall to apologize to Jesse for being so rude the night before by yelling through the wall. But the neighbor said he found Jesse's door was wide open. And he didn't look inside, he felt like that was kind of rude. But what he thought was, okay, maybe Jesse was so drunk the night before, that was part of the reason that he must have been having this fight. And so perhaps he was so drunk, he just forgot to close the door on his way out or on his way to bed. The neighbor said he did try knocking on the open door a couple of times, but Jesse never came to the door. And so the neighbor just kind of left it at that and went about his business. And so after hearing this, Detective Short asked this neighbor if he had any idea who the other man was that Jesse was fighting with. But the neighbor said he didn't. Jesse, for the most part, kept to himself, and really, the neighbor didn't know Jesse well at all. So, he had no idea who this other person could have been. After that, Short thanked the neighbor for the information. Then, he turned around and headed back inside of Jesse's apartment. And so, at this point, Short was convinced that, based on the neighbor's testimony, that whatever fight led to Jesse's death likely did begin inside Jesse's apartment. And so now Short just had to figure out who were the people that could have potentially been inside of Jesse's apartment so late at night like that. Was this somebody who was a friend, a love interest? Was Jesse trying to kick them out and it sparked a fight? He didn't know. But who were the people in Jesse's life that could have been there late at night? That's what he had to figure out. And luckily, at that very moment, one of the crime scene techs had Jesse's cell phone, and he was holding it up in the air like he had found something important. Now, they wouldn't be able to do a full phone dump until they got it back to the station, and they hadn't even touched the laptop yet. But they had gotten access to Jesse's call logs. And the tech told Short that there was something in there that he would definitely want to see. Because the last time Jesse used his cell phone, according to this log, it was to call somebody named Jack Barry. 7 times. Between 3 a.m. and 3:18 a.m. that morning. So, right away, Detective Short looked up Jack Barry's information, and he found his apartment's address and saw it was not far from Jesse's. And so, he drove right over there. Short knocked on the door, and just a moment later, a young man answered. He had very red, puffy eyes, like he had clearly been crying for a while. Even though Jesse's body had only been discovered a few hours ago, this young man did not seem surprised at all to see a detective at his door. He told the detective that he had already heard the terrible news. A friend had called and told him. After exchanging niceties and the young man confirming that he was in fact Jack, Short followed Jack into his living room. And as they sat down, Short asked Jack about all those 3 a.m. phone calls from Jesse. Jack looked like he was really struggling to hold it together as he told the detective that Jesse was his ex-boyfriend. And Jesse had been kept badgering him, Jack, for them to get back together, and Jack didn't want to. And so those phone calls were very likely a product of more badgering from Jesse. Jack said the night before he had been woken up by his phone ringing over and over and over again. And before he could even look at the caller ID, he heard a knock at his front door. He saw that it was the middle of the night. And then he leaned over and he saw the caller was Jesse. And he sort of figured that, okay, he's calling me. It's very likely him at the front door. I don't want to see him right now. And so Jack just decided he would ignore Jesse and hope that he would eventually go away. Now, when Jack said this, it seemed very clear he was sort of reliving that moment in his mind. Like, maybe if he had let Jesse in or engaged with him in some way, maybe Jesse would still be alive. That was sort of the insinuation. But Detective Short was thinking, okay, well, even though he seems like he's being very earnest in telling me this, it does mean that he doesn't really have an alibi. He's basically saying that at the time Jesse was killed, he was home alone by himself, which was a pretty weak alibi. However, before Short could begin to poke holes in it, Jack said that, despite the fact that they had broken up, that he and Jesse were, at least in his mind, still on good terms. In fact, they had spoken just the day before on the phone, before getting all those nighttime phone calls. It was during the afternoon. And during that phone call, Jesse had told him all about a new guy he'd met at a club the night before. And his name was Ed McDevitt. That night, Detective Short stood outside of an interrogation room at the police station, watching Ed McDevitt through the two-way glass. Short knew his investigation was moving basically at lightning speed here. But there was still quite a bit of pressure on him to get this case solved even faster. Because Columbia was a college town, a place where kids were used to feeling safe, and the murder of a student just a few blocks off campus had sort of shattered that sense of trust. And so, students and parents and the staff of the university, they really wanted Short to get this thing done quickly. And now, looking at Ed through the glass, Short wondered if maybe this was the killer. Maybe this was the guy. I mean, after all, Ed was visibly shaking and fidgety looking. I mean, he seemed sort of like an emotional wreck. Which could mean, of course, that he was just upset because he was connected to the murder victim. That's a traumatic thing to go through. Or it could mean he was hiding something, and now he was about to be interrogated by the police, something that would certainly cause a big emotional reaction. Eventually, Short went inside and sat down across the table, and he asked Ed to explain exactly what he had done the night before. And Ed, in a very nervous, shaky voice, told the detective that he and his roommate, a guy named Mark Butler, had met Jesse at a party a little after 11 p.m. He said he ultimately went back home again around 3 a.m., leaving Jesse on the sidewalk, still very much alive and well. Ed said his roommate Mark had actually seen him return to their apartment at 3 a.m. And Ed said when he went inside, he went straight to bed, and then he had gotten up early for work. Ed said he was at work when he got the call from police telling him that Jesse had been found dead. Detective Short listened to Ed's story, and he asked a few follow-up questions. And then he also took a DNA sample from Ed. And then after that, he told Ed that he was also going to get a warrant to search Ed's home. Ed was already such a wreck that, when Short told him about this search of his home, Ed didn't even really react. However, when Short left the interview room, despite feeling pretty confident that Ed could absolutely be a suspect, he also went and, followed procedure, and he looked up Ed's roommate, Mark Butler. And he discovered in the police department system that there was a Mark Butler, and sure enough, he had a criminal record. So, overnight, while a forensics team was searching Ed and Mark's home, Short actually brought Mark down to the station for an interview. But in reality, Short wasn't expecting Mark to become this primary suspect here. He just wanted to be thorough and rule out anybody who had seen Jesse that night. And obviously, Mark was one of those people. But almost immediately in their interview, Mark started saying some very odd things. he told Short right out of the gate that he did not like Jesse. And actually, he said point blank that he didn't really care that Jesse was dead. But he also clarified to Detective Short that, he was just Ed's roommate. He was not seeing him romantically, so this had nothing to do with jealousy. He just did not like Jesse as a person. Mark confirmed that he did see Ed when he returned from the party around 3 a.m., just like Ed had said. But Mark had actually not stuck around. He said that after Ed had come back to the apartment, Mark had left to go on a date of his own. And he actually didn't know what time he got back home. And so as he was saying this, Short realized that that meant Mark was out and about, sort of unaccounted for, at the same time that Jesse was killed. And so, obviously, something seemed off about Mark. And so Short took a DNA sample from him and added Mark to the growing suspect list. The next morning, Sunday, June 6th, after catching a few hours of sleep, Detective Short gathered his team for a meeting. The mood in the room was tense. Everybody was exhausted and very much on edge from spending nearly 24 hours straight working on this case. But when they went around the room and talked about the flood of leads they had all followed up on yesterday, it didn't actually seem like they had much to show for it. There were now several suspects in play, but none of them seemed to have a good, solid reason to want to kill Jesse Valencia. Jesse had apparently been pestering his ex-boyfriend Jack about trying to get back together, which Jack did not want. And the multiple late-night phone calls and the knocking on the door unannounced, it just seemed like harassment. So, it was possible that maybe Jack had gone over to confront Jesse and things had gotten out of hand. But Jack had told Detective Short that he and Jesse had remained friends after the breakup. And some of the other detectives said that Jesse's friends had said the same thing. The two had remained friends. So, it seemed pretty unlikely that things between them would have escalated so much that somebody got killed. Then there was Ed McDevitt, Jesse's new lover, who had seemed pretty nervous during his interrogation. One of the detectives told Short that while they were searching Ed's house, they had found a bag full of chef's knives, and some of them were large and sharp enough that they could easily have been the murder weapon. But Ed worked in a restaurant and was training to be a chef, so owning a set of kitchen knives was hardly a smoking gun. And then, as for Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, he did have a criminal past, and he openly said he did not like Jesse and didn't care that he had died. But they had only met one time, and it was very likely they would never have seen each other again. So it seemed very unlikely that he would go through the trouble of following Jesse home and killing him. To what end? And so Detective Short was getting really frustrated. He just couldn't make sense of any of these suspects. It was like a key piece of the puzzle was missing here. And so he turned to two of his detectives, Jeff Westbrook and Barbara Cook, and told them to go to some of the local bars that Jesse frequented and just sort of ask around about Jesse, in case there were other leads or other people in his life that they had not uncovered yet. However, right after Detective Short walked out of that meeting that morning, another detective ran up to him and pulled him into a quiet corner. He told him a tip had just come in, and it was so sensitive that they were going to have to keep it under wraps, even amongst the other investigators on the case. The detective told Short that a friend of Jesse's who lived in St. Louis, Louis had called the tip in through Crime Stoppers. He said that he and Jesse chatted online all the time, and that Jesse at one point had told him about a secret affair he was having with an older man. And this older man was actually an officer in the Columbia Police Department. Later that day, so this is Sunday, the 6th of June, 2004, 2 days after Jesse was killed, Detective Short sat at his desk, flipping through printouts of all these online chat logs. And these logs showed conversations between Jesse and the friend of his who had called in the tip that Jesse was having this affair with an officer from Short's own police department. In the chats, Jesse wrote all about this relationship. Jesse had seemed to find it pretty exciting at first, having this police officer come by in uniform and carrying on these secret meetups in the middle of the night. But recently, Jesse had begun to suspect that this police officer was married, and this had made Jesse furious. He had told this friend in the chat log that he wasn't going to be someone's other woman. However, to Short's immense frustration, Jesse never actually named the officer that he was having this affair with. He only ever referred to him as Columbia's finest. And so, whoever this mystery cop was, Detective Short thought they were now the most likely suspect. Because unlike Jesse's other lovers, this officer had something very significant to lose if this relationship went south. If Jesse told anybody about this affair, well, the police officer's career could be on the line because they were clearly carrying on this totally illicit affair while they were on duty. You know, that's not okay. And also, they were using their position and power potentially to actually land this relationship. And then on top of that, the police officer's marriage would likely be destroyed. But Short also knew that he had to move very, very carefully here. Because now he was investigating his own department, which meant that the killer could literally be in the room with him at any time. And so, as he walked through the office to refill his coffee, Short found himself scanning the face of every single officer he passed. And he realized there wasn't a single person here that he could actually trust. Short brought all the files on Jesse's case into his office, and then he told his secretary to find him a complete roster of the department's entire staff. Then he locked the door, sat down at his desk, and he pulled out the records on Jesse's friends who had been interviewed already. And he went down the list himself, calling each and every one of them to dig for more information about this supposed officer. Quite a few of them said that Jesse had in fact told them about this cop he was sleeping with, and one of them remembered Jesse referring to this officer as just Anderson. And so, when Short's secretary came back with the staff roster, Short began looking through it. And he discovered that out of the 200-plus officers in the entire department, there were only 2 officers that had the last name: Anderson, Brad Anderson, and Ted Anderson. And so the next logical step was trying to figure out if either one of them had a connection to Jesse Valencia. And so, Short pulled out the records from Jesse's arrest at that house party back in April. And as he flipped through the report, he realized that Brad Anderson was one of the 3 officers who had responded to that party. The pieces fit together perfectly. Jesse and Brad Anderson, the police officer, would have met around the same time that Jesse began messaging his friend in St. Louis about this secret affair with a cop. And so, at this point, Short felt like he had just found his killer. So, he grabbed a manila folder off his desk, stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. Then, he did a lap around the whole station, and eventually, he spotted Brad Anderson in the locker room, chatting with a few other officers as he put on his uniform for his shift. Now, Short wanted to be very careful here because if Brad Anderson was the killer, he certainly didn't want him to realize he was under suspicion right now. So, Short waited in the hallway until Brad walked out of the locker room, and then, as casually as possible, Short caught up with him and pulled him aside. Short opened up the manila folder he had brought with him, and he showed Brad a photo of Jesse Valencia, asking if he recognized him. And Brad squinted at the photo for a second, and then after thinking, he said, "Yeah, that's the kid I arrested at a party a few months ago." Short asked Brad if he had seen Jesse at all since the arrest, and Brad nodded and said, "Yeah." He said that about a month ago, Jesse had called in a noise complaint, and Brad had been the one sent out to check on it. But by the time Brad got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only there for a couple of minutes before leaving. And that was it. To Short, nothing about Brad's demeanor seemed nervous or suspicious. In fact, it really seemed like he didn't have any clue why the detective was asking him about Jesse Valencia. So, if he was the killer, it seemed like he was going to be very hard to crack. Short was about to let Brad go and just wait to talk to him once he had more evidence. But just then, Brad's partner, Officer Rios, walked by. And when he walked by, he looked over and he saw the manila folder with Jesse Valencia's photo inside of it that Short was showing Brad Anderson. And Rios, without even thinking, made this comment under his breath that was clearly directed at his partner. It was like this really in bad taste comment where he said, "Oh, looks like your gay lover's dead." When Short heard this, he practically sprinted back to his office. Brad Anderson had sort of shrugged off the comment made by Rios about Jesse being his gay lover. But Short felt like what Rios said was a pretty big deal. Because even though, again, it was terrible, in bad taste humor, that's a terrible thing to say, but maybe there was truth in it. maybe Rios knew that Brad Anderson was seeing Jesse Valencia. Maybe they really were in a relationship. Now, in the moment, Short did not aggressively follow up on that comment and demand to know if Brad had actually been in a relationship with Jesse before he died. Instead, all three of them just kind of went their separate ways. And Short, he hustled back to his office. And when he was in his office, right as he sat down, there was a knock on the door. And when the door opened, it was Short's secretary. And she told him there was someone who had been waiting to see him. And then she led in this very nervous-looking young man who introduced himself as Jesse's friend. And he said his name was Andy Schermerhorn. Andy sat down and told Short that just a few weeks earlier, he and Jesse had gone out together and then had gone back to Jesse's apartment. But around 3 a.m., they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jesse went to answer it, and a uniformed police officer walked in, shining a flashlight around the room. And to Andy's surprise, Jesse led this officer right into the bedroom, and he joined them for a threesome. And then, after they were done, the cop looked at Andy and told him, "You better keep this a secret." Detective Short couldn't believe it. I mean, the final piece of evidence he needed had just fallen right into his lap. Andy said he did not know the officer's name. So Detective Short got out a department yearbook, and he told him to flip through it to see if maybe the guy he saw that night was in there. But Andy just held up his hand and said he didn't need to do that. And Detective Short was like, "Well, what do you mean? Why can't you do that?" And Andy said, "Well, because when I came in here, the guy I met, he was out in the hall." Based on the investigation that would follow this revelation, the following is what happened to Jesse Valencia in the early morning of the 5th of June, 2004. Around 3 a.m., right around the time that Jesse was leaving his friend Jennifer's party, Jesse's killer was drinking beers with a few friends after his work shift had ended. And then, just before dawn, the killer wrapped up, got in their car, and started to drive home. But as they were driving, they decided to make a stop along the way at Jesse's apartment. They were expecting another quick, no-strings-attached, late-night secret hookup just like they'd had before. But when they got there, Jesse was very drunk and in a terrible mood. Jesse confronted the killer. He told them that he had figured out that they were married. And so now, he was not interested in them at all. He didn't want to see them anymore. But when he told the killer to leave, the killer refused. And so Jesse said, "Fine, I'll go to your police chief and I will tell them all about our affair." And that's when the killer snapped. If their secret got out, it would cost them everything. Their job, their marriage, their family, their reputation. So, in their mind, they had to silence Jesse before he could ruin them. Jesse tried to run, but he only made it about a block before the killer caught up with him, wrapped a powerful arm around his neck, and put him in a vicious chokehold until his body went limp. And then, the killer laid Jesse's unconscious body out on the grass, took out a pocket knife, and brutally slashed his throat. On the way home, the killer, a police officer, very skillfully disposed of the murder weapon, ensuring that nobody would ever find it. Because they knew that the knife was the only piece of hard evidence that could ever link them directly to the murder. After that, they made their way back home, parked in the driveway, and as they were walking up to their front door, they looked up and saw their wife in the kitchen window, preparing a bottle for their baby son. And then, just before going inside, the killer unpinned the name tag from their uniform that said Anderson, and they swapped it for another name tag that they had hidden in their glove box. And this name tag was the killer's real name, Officer Steven Rios. Rios was Brad Anderson's partner. He was the one who had identified Jesse's body at the crime scene and made that awful, revealing comment about Brad Anderson's gay lover. It's believed that Officer Rios was lying to Jesse about his name from the very beginning. And in fact, he had actually stolen the name tag not of Brad Anderson, but of the other Anderson in the department, Ted Anderson. He was using that officer's name tag and parading around like he was him whenever he was with Jesse, a calculated deception to protect his true identity. Steven Rios was arrested, and in May of 2005, almost a year after Jesse's murder, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. But after an appeal, he was granted a new trial and the charge was reduced to second-degree murder. However, he was still found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Jesse Valencia thought he was beginning a new chapter of his life that summer. Instead, within just 48 hours, he became the center of one of the most disturbing murder cases Columbia, Missouri had ever seen. Thank you so much for watching. If today's case stayed with you, let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to watch more true crime stories, check out the playlist linked on screen now. Until next time. In the year 2025, on June 29th, a woman by the name of June Baxter, who was 83 years old at the time, made her way slowly down the hallway of her simple home in Attleborough, which is a small town located in the eastern region of England. Her passing occurred at approximately 8:20 in the morning, according to the exact time. She suffered from a number of medical conditions that caused her to be rather fragile. As a result of these conditions, she was required to keep one hand on the wall in order to maintain her balance or stability while she was walking. For her to be able to walk, this was an essential requirement. Despite the difficulties she faced on a physical level, June placed a larger focus on her independence than she did on anything else. This was the case regardless of the circumstances. This was something that she was extremely excited to continue doing, despite the fact that her family believed that she was taking a little bit of a risk by continuing to live on her own in her own house. She was really eager to continue having this experience. During the time when June, her husband, and their cherished little puppy were all living in this house together, there was a period of time when they were all living there together. It was a pattern that was comfortable, there was a lot of life going on, and the house was full of people going about their everyday lives. From the flip side of the coin, it is important to note that her spouse had been diagnosed with a serious illness around 7 years before to this event. Because his illness required a big amount of care and attention, June and he were forced to make the painful decision of entrusting their dog to their granddaughter during this period of time. This decision was made because of the fact that his condition required a significant amount of care and attention. To put it another way, they were not able to successfully manage the responsibility of taking care of a pet while simultaneously monitoring his health. In spite of the fact that it was a particularly sad day, they arrived at the conclusion that it was the most prudent choice. June's husband passed away almost soon after that, and the house was suddenly filled with an awful sense of emptiness. June's spouse had been dying for quite some time. Only she was the only one who was by herself. On the other hand, the fact that she was within the confines of the house by herself did not necessarily imply that she was completely cut off from the rest of the world. The woman who had taken in her dog was not only her granddaughter, but also her grandchild, and she lived in close proximity to her the entire time. June was a constant presence in her life, and anytime she entered her environment, she welcomed her with open arms. June was a constant presence in her life. She would nearly always bring June's aged dog along with her on her regular visits. This was something that she did virtually every time. This is the manner in which she would conduct herself the vast majority of the time. Throughout those exchanges, June maintained an attitude that was one of complete and full joy. As she gazed at her dog and felt the familiar fur of her dog under her fingertips, she experienced a sense of comfort that was impossible to put into words. She felt a sense of comfort at the same time. The fact that she was thinking about her puppy allowed her to be successful in achieving this goal. Not only did June's granddaughter provide her happiness, but she also went out of her way to save her in a number of different ways. June cherished her grandchild above all else in the world. In no way, shape, or form did she ever find herself in a situation in which she was unable to offer June support with the practical duties that had become rather challenging for her. She would be responsible for performing the weekly grocery shopping, picking up her prescriptions, and picking up her meds from the pharmacy, in addition to transporting her to and from each of her doctor's appointments. In addition, she would be responsible for taking her to and from hospital appointments. Her granddaughter had made it abundantly clear on multiple occasions that all June needed to do was call, and she would be there instantly without any questions being asked. This was the only thing that June needed to do. June simply needed to provide this one command in order to complete the task. June, who had a personality that was fiercely independent, made every attempt to avoid imposing an excessive amount of dependence on her granddaughter. This was despite the fact that June had a personality that was fiercely independent. By any stretch of the imagination, she had no intention of being a burden to anyone. The most essential thing for her was to demonstrate to herself that she was still capable of standing on her own and handling things. She was mostly driven by this motivation. Something that she could look back on with a great deal of pride was the moment in question. Therefore, on this particular morning, she was simply concentrating on her routine daily ritual as she made her way down the hallway, her hand following the pattern of the wallpaper for the purpose of keeping stability. She was doing this because she was trying to keep her balance. For the very first time in her life, she turned around and went into the restroom, which was a room that she had been to a great number of times all during her existence. Without a shadow of a doubt, she never wavered from her decision. When compared to the previous instance, however, this time around, different circumstances prevailed. The moment her foot made contact with the cool tile floor, it slipped out from beneath her and she fell to the ground. The occurrence took place precisely at that precise instant. There was no opportunity to take advantage of anything that was accessible at this time, and it was not possible to provide a response at this moment in time. As she was falling, the sharp corner of the toilet counter made a forceful contact with the side of her leg, which caused her to sustain major injuries. A major injury was sustained by her as a result of this act. As a consequence of this, she began to fall more and further into the depression. The guy experienced pain that was both instantaneous and terrible right away. Even though she let out a scream, the sound was muffled by the walls of her house, which were completely barren of any residents. Despite this, she was able to hear the sound. It was nearly impossible for anyone to pick up on her voice. Only when she looked down did she notice that a lengthy cut on her leg was beginning to flow the first few droplets of blood. She was surprised to find out that the cut was bleeding. Following a little amount of time, the first sensations of shock and pain were rapidly replaced by a cold surge of anxiety brought on by the unknown. Indeed, this was the conclusion. It was the same situation that she had always been concerned about, the one that her family had cautioned her about when she was younger, and it was the same situation that she was now confronted with. When she was by herself and there was no one to assist her, she took a significant amount of harm and suffered a great deal of pain. However, she was also hurt. Despite the fact that she had always insisted on living by herself, she had never really given much thought to what she would do in the case of a significant emergency. She had never really given much thought to what she would do either. What she would do was something that she had never really given much thought to before. As far as she was concerned, her primary purpose was to protect herself from getting wounded as much as possible. She was attempting to avoid getting wounded in any way. On the other hand, this method had not shown any signs of producing any noticeable results. The fortunate circumstance for June was that she did not completely lack a safety net. This was a fortunate circumstance for her. In the aftermath of the passing of her husband, her granddaughter insisted on having a network of emergency call bells put in every room of the house. One of her goals was to have this particular action carried out. The majority of the time, these were straightforward electrical gadgets that comprised of a cord that was suspended from the ceiling. It would immediately send a notification to the phone that belonged to her granddaughter whenever the line was withdrawn as soon as it was pulled. In addition to that, it would get in touch with the emergency services in the area. The bells were discovered in the restroom of the building, which was one of the locations included in the investigation. June was attempting to ignore the throbbing pain in her leg while she was lying on the floor. She reached up and clutched for the ceiling as she attempted to concentrate on the agony. With a sense of relief, she pulled on the thread with all of her effort when she had discovered it by her hand. She was relieved to have found the thread. There was a 10-minute stretch of time that separated the two periods. After what seemed like an eternity, time seemed to continue to pass. While June remained on the floor of the restroom, she was using a hand towel to apply pressure to the incision on her leg. She was doing this in an effort to slow down the rate at which she was bleeding. That same instant, she was finally able to hear the sound that she had been eagerly anticipating. The front door of her house opened. She had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Only a few moments later, she became aware of her granddaughter's voice, which was filled with concern as she called her name. She was concerned about her grandchild. Concerned about her grandchild, she did not feel well. June made an effort to call her back and let her know where she was located, but her voice was a little muffled. At the same time, she let her know where she was. In the span of a fraction of a second, her granddaughter materialized in the vicinity of the entranceway to the restroom. In addition to this, June's senior dog was following her around and walking directly behind her, pushing past her legs as she went about her regular chores. During the time that June was lying on the ground, both of them were able to see the blood that was on her face as well as the expression of misery that was on her face. It would have been impossible to ignore the worry that her granddaughter was expressing with her words. At the time that she was given the warning, she could not have possibly thought that the cut would be as severe as it actually was. On the other hand, June experienced a profound sense of comfort when she saw her granddaughter standing there, and when she saw her dog coming over to her with its tail wagging nervously. Both of these sensations brought her a sense of relief. Her attention was drawn back to the here and now by both of these occurrences. No matter how severe the cut was, it was of no consequence, whatever the severity of the cut was. It was possible to obtain assistance. At first, it appeared as though everything was going to be well on its own. Almost immediately, her dog came up to her and began gently exploring her palm while murmuring in a low voice. It was as if it had detected that something was very wrong with her. At first glance, it appeared as though it had found out that something was definitely not right. June started to feel a little bit more at ease while her granddaughter was frantically searching through the cupboards in the bathroom for bandages and disinfectant. This occurred when June's granddaughter was seeking for these items. During the time that she was stretching out with a hand that was shaking, she began to pat her dog, who was obviously quite concerned about her. The connection that they had remained just as strong as it had been in the past, despite the fact that a considerable period of time had elapsed since they had first met. The dog's presence on the premises brought a significant degree of comfort to the individuals who were there. After a certain amount of time had passed, her granddaughter was able to successfully locate a first aid kit and eventually found her way back to the house. Bandages were placed over the wound in a secure manner with the purpose of protecting it after the wound had been thoroughly cleaned to the best of her ability during the process. By the time the paramedics arrived a few minutes later, June's mental state had greatly improved, and the most of the bleeding had stopped by that point. June's condition had also significantly improved on its own. June's condition was also showing significant signs of improvement at the same time for her. There was no doubt that the soreness in her leg continued to exist, but the presence of her granddaughter and her dog had brought about a significant change in the conditions. When the paramedics entered the crowded restroom, they brought their equipment with them, which resulted in the space becoming more crowded than it had been before. When they were squatting down to evaluate her injury, they did so in a manner that was both professional and empathetic. This was the case throughout the entire process. They began by carefully removing the improvised bandage that her granddaughter had applied to the region before proceeding to remove it for good. They did this in order to get a better look at the wound that was causing them discomfort. A reassuring smile formed on the face of one of them as they looked up at June while they were in the process of finishing the thorough cleaning. As a result of the facts that he revealed with her, she was given the impression that it was significantly more dreadful than it actually was. It was a reduction that, when everything was taken into consideration, was not quite that big. The assertion that he made was that she would not even require stitches under any circumstances. They suggested that she keep it clean and possibly have her granddaughter stay for a limited period of time in order to reduce the likelihood of her falling again. The purpose of this was to prevent her from falling again in the future. On the other hand, the medical professionals stated that she was in perfect, healthy condition. They did not display any signs that there was a cause for concern. When the paramedics were in the process of gathering their belongings and leaving the premises that they were in, June expressed her gratitude to them after they had completed their duties. It was a little time in which she, her granddaughter, and the dog were all sitting together on the floor of the restroom, and during that brief moment, there was an emotion of collective thankfulness that permeated the ambiance. They were under the impression that they had been able to avoid being struck by a gunshot. There is a possibility that the fall had a lot more devastating consequences than what was initially thought. Not just a shattered hip, but also a brain injury that was acquired throughout the incident. When I was just left with a small cut on my leg, it felt like a fortunate escape from the situation that I was previously in. When June awoke the following morning in her bed, she was immediately aware that something was wrong. August, on the other hand, was not conscious of anything at all. Her boyfriend had been the one she had been sleeping with. Despite the fact that she was merely lying there, she felt sick to her stomach since her heart was beating so hard against her ribs the entire time. In spite of the fact that she had not even sat up yet, she was experiencing nausea and vomiting. She was experiencing emotions of lightheadedness and dizziness, and she also got the impression that the room was softly spinning. She was also experiencing a feeling of lightheadedness. She was completely covered in a layer of sweat that was everywhere on her body. This was in no way typical in any way, shape, or form. A horrific experience for everyone involved was the fact that this had never happened before in the history of the world. Her granddaughter had remained at the spot for a few hours after the paramedics had left the previous day, after they had left the scene. During the time that they were having their conversation, they performed a number of things, including drinking tea, making sure that June was comfortable, and making sure that everything she required was within easy reach. Despite June's assurance that she was in good condition, her granddaughter eventually left, promising to call with an update in the morning. June told her granddaughter that she was all right. The granddaughter of June had assured her that she would call with one. June had experienced some discomfort in the area surrounding the cut on her leg that evening, which was to be expected. However, it did not appear to be a significant illness. June's leg had been cut. A cut had been made in June's leg. As she began to drift off to sleep, she was left with the impression that she had been extremely fortunate throughout the course of the day. However, at this point, which was probably 12 hours later, something was going on inside her body that was extremely, extremely wrong. This was the case. June was unable to determine with absolute certainty whether or not the cut that was on her thigh was connected to the new and concerning symptoms that she was experiencing. June was having these symptoms. As far as I can tell, this is the situation. As far as the paramedics are concerned, the event was not a particularly serious one. On the other hand, the severity of what she was going through, in conjunction with the sensation that her body was moving in the wrong direction, caused her to make the decision that she would absolutely not take any chances. Within the context of this particular situation, she did not pull the emergency cord that was available to her. She extended her hand to the phone that was put on the table next to her bed and dialed the number for an ambulance in order to have her transported to the hospital. She intended for the ambulance to take her to the hospital. The medical staff immediately became aware of her situation the moment she arrived at the emergency room, and they immediately began carrying out a battery of examinations as soon as they were aware of her condition. Her temperature was taken and blood was drawn from her as part of the comprehensive assessment of her vital signs that was carried out. After they had finally figured out what was going on, they were able to discover what was going on in a reasonably short amount of time. Upon completion of the examinations, it was found that she was suffering from a severe bacterial disease. The conclusion that was arrived at was found to be this. Upon further investigation, the medical professionals arrived at the conclusion that the open cut on her leg served as the point of entry for the bacteria that had invaded her body. Upon conducting their examination of her, they came to this ultimate conclusion. The fact that the sickness had already made its way into her system was an aspect of the circumstance that was much more distressing. It was because of this that she was experiencing feelings of lightheadedness and perspiration, and it also provided an explanation to the question of why her heart was racing so quickly. The emergency medical condition is known as sepsis, and it is a condition that poses a considerable risk to the individual who is being treated. The medical team was taken aback as a result of this, given the circumstances. They had a number of inquiries that would be considered to be of great significance. It is inconceivable that a cut that appeared to be very minor could have resulted in the development of such a severe sickness in such a short amount of time. The report that was submitted by the paramedics indicated that they had cleaned the wound in a proper manner prior to departing from the scene. There was not a single item that made any type of sense. On the other hand, at this particular moment in time, they were not directly concerned with locating an answer to the question of how it had occurred. All of their concentration was focused on making an effort to preserve June's life. Nobody else was paying attention to anything else. An emergency course of therapy was devised for her, which included the administration of potent antibiotics that were effective against a wide range of infections. When it comes to treating with an infection that is known to be unknown, this is the normal process that is followed. As a result of the fact that these antibiotics are of a more generic character, it is predicted that they will be successful in treating the bacteria that are responsible for the issue. June, on the other hand, was not receiving any kind of aid from it in any sense of the word. Her health did not improve, despite the fact that she exerted a great deal of effort. It was beyond reasonable doubt that the situation was deteriorating, and it was deteriorating at a rapid pace. At that point in time, June had already reached the age of 83, and her health was already in a position that was deemed to be relatively poor. Her physical being simply did not possess the reserves that were necessary to protect itself against such a tremendous onslaught. It was simply not feasible for her to have those reserves. The quick deterioration of her condition that was taking place was something that they witnessed right in front of their very eyes. All of the medical personnel were well aware that they were competing against the clock in order to complete their tasks. An ineffectiveness was identified with the antibiotics that were considered to be fundamental. In order for them to have any chance of surviving, it was vital for them to determine the specific type of bacteria that was responsible for this sickness. Only then could they have any hope of saving themselves. If they were able to identify the treatment, they might be able to use a treatment that is better targeted to the specific condition. As an illustration, they could be able to make use of an antibiotic that has been developed with the express purpose of eliminating that particular intruder. In order to isolate and identify the microscopic foe that was responsible for her death, they started doing further tests, one of which was the culture of her blood. This was done in an effort to solve the mystery of what caused her death. It was of the utmost importance that they obtain responses, and they anticipated receiving them as quickly as possible. When June's granddaughter arrived at the hospital, she was greeted by a doctor who then proceeded to have a conversation with her. June's granddaughter had rushed to the hospital as soon as she heard the news. Her granddaughter June had hurriedly made her way to the hospital. In addition to requesting that she walk him through the events that had taken place the day before, beginning with the moment she arrived at the house, he also demanded that she guide him through each step of the process. Every single thing was crucial to him, regardless of how minor or unimportant it might appear to be. He was meticulous in his attention to detail. His attention to detail was impeccable in every single respect. He inquired about the fall, the wound, and the method in which she wrapped it. He asked these questions in order to have more information. In spite of the fact that her voice was quivering with nervousness during the entirety of the story, the granddaughter continued to relate the tale. The manner in which she discovered her grandma laying on the ground, the manner in which she sought for the first aid kit, and the manner in which the paramedics arrived at the scene were all meticulously described in her narrative. While the physician was attentively listening, he nodded his head in agreement with what was being said. An inquiry was made by him. He made an inquiry. He inquired, "Was there anything else?" he asked. The granddaughter pondered for a little period of time. "Has there been anything at all that occurred in the restroom while you were searching for bandages?" From that very moment on, her thoughts were a jumbled mixture of panic and confusion. She was worried about anything that had occurred in the restroom, and she was anxious about it. Following that, however, a picture was presented to the viewer. She murmured in a quiet voice, "Her dog," saying it. "That's her dog. I brought her dog with me." He was in there with us. The doctor's approach remained the same, however, he leaned in somewhat closer to the patient who was present. "That's her dog." He made the request, "Tell me about the dog," and I said that I would comply with his request. "I brought her dog with me. What was the dog doing?" As the granddaughter reflected on the series of occurrences that had taken place, she began to experience tears welling up in her eyes. She made it clear that he was merely attempting to alleviate the suffering that she was going through at the time. A look of rising terror appeared on her face as she hesitated and said, June was on the floor, petting him. He was licking her hand and, oh God, he was licking her leg. He was licking the cut. I didn't think anything of it. I thought he was just trying to clean it, to make her feel better. The doctor thanked her and instructed her to wait to return to the laboratory. After that, he hurriedly went back to the laboratory in order to proceed with his journey before continuing on. In spite of the fact that his suspicion was a disastrous one, he was able to develop it. There was a point in time when the findings from the laboratory were brought back to the laboratory. After everything was said and done, the tests were successful in identifying the bacteria that should be eliminated. However, by the time they were able to determine the name, it was already too late for any treatment that was specifically targeted to make a difference in the circumstance where they found themselves. Her immune system was completely weakened by the virus, and it took complete control of her body. As June was suffering from acute sepsis, a condition that offers a significant threat to her chances of survival, she was in a terrible danger of not surviving. When the body's response to an infection becomes so intense that it begins to cause harm to the body's own tissues and important organs, the signs of this condition become apparent. This disorder is characterized by a dysfunction in the immune system. Because her body was making a frantic effort to defend itself against the invasion, her body was, in effect, shutting himself down. This was because her body was trying to combat the invasion. The members of the medical staff were successful in doing everything that they were able to successfully complete. Despite their efforts to treat her with a variety of treatments and even put her on life support, the illness continued to progress without any interruptions. However, these precautions were not adequate to prevent the virus from spreading further. As a result of the illness that she had been afflicted with, June Baxter passed dead just 1 week after she was sent to the hospital for treatment. In the end, it would be revealed that the potentially harmful bacteria that had made its way into June's open wound had been administered to her in the most heinous and unexpected manner that could possibly be dreamt of. The situation would be like this. Additionally, the bacterium was referred to as Pasteurella multocida for the purpose of providing additional information. However, the bacterium in question is not the kind that is generally discovered on the floor of a lavatory or in the nook of a countertop. This is because the bacterium in question is not a mold. It is specifically located in the interior of the lips of domestic cats and dogs. Examples of these animals include cats and dogs. The location in question is really specific. During the time that June was waiting for her granddaughter to locate bandages, her cherished and elderly dog was behaving in the same manner that it had always done. This took place at the same time that June was making herself comfortable on the floor of the restroom. The purpose of this was to comfort her that there was nothing wrong with her. It was able to convey its feelings of compassion and concern for the people who were in its close area by utilizing the only means that were accessible to it. In addition, the dog had begun licking the wound that was exposed in front of her as a means of providing her with some degree of comfort for the time being. Irrespective of the fact that it was a gesture of affection toward a member of its pack who had been harmed, it was also an inclination to care for the individual in question. However, as a result of this action, the dog had unwittingly delivered the germs that caused Pasteurella multocida into June's bloodstream. This illness was caused by the bacteria that caused the disease. The dog's saliva included these microorganisms which were discovered. The wound had been cleaned by the paramedics when they arrived. Nevertheless, by the time they had finished, the germs had already started to spread throughout the body. It became impossible to maintain control over the situation, and it started to grow at a breakneck speed. In spite of the fact that the individual had been younger and in better health, it is still feasible that the immune system would have been able to prevent the illness from happening. On the other hand, there was a sentence of death for a woman who was 83 years old and experienced significant health issues prior to the sentence being handed down. Her execution was carried out. The aftermath of the catastrophe was unfortunately a very unpleasant one due to the circumstances. To put it another way, there was no offense that required legal action to be taken, and there was no one who was to blame for the situation. An extremely peculiar accident occurred as a result of a fleeting time of feelings of devotion. The accident was caused by a brief moment of devotion. In light of the events that transpired, June's granddaughter was left with a significant amount of humiliation that she had to carry with her. She had to come to grips with the fact that she had unknowingly set in motion the series of events that ultimately led to her grandmother's dying by bringing the dog that she thought would provide her grandmother with peace. She had brought the puppy to her grandmother in the mistaken belief that it would provide her with comfort. She was forced to confront the reality that she was the one who was responsible for the passing of her grandma. The dog that June had loved so much, the one that served as a live link to her late husband and happier times, was the unknowing instrument that had led to her passing away earlier than she had intended. June had loved the puppy so much that it served as a living link to her husband and happier times. The dog had been of great affection to June. The painful irony that exists is one that, when everything is taken into consideration, is nearly impossible to fathom. It was a simple fall, a small cut, and an act of love from a devoted pet that all came together in the most terrible way possible, resulting in the death of a woman who had only wanted to spend her final years in the quiet and freedom of her own home. The woman's death was the result of all of these little things coming together. Friends and family of the deceased woman suffered a terrible loss when she passed away. To begin, I would like to convey my appreciation for your presence in this room today. In the event that you watch the program that was broadcast tonight, I would be grateful if you could please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. It is also important to keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime available for you to view all at once right now. Within a single sitting, you are able to watch all of these episodes, at least until the next time we get together. How are things going?